Hey, I didn't really give any notice on this. If people are maybe looking for me on Twitter today, I decided this afternoon to deactivate my Twitter account. I guess you get 30 days to sort of decide in terms of reinstating, and I'm just not sure if I'm gonna go back. But I guess I'm just gonna I've been working really hard to do a lot of original research to try to provide some context around what I see happening in terms of the specific mechanics of these cybernetic enclosures and the finance and the religious overtones that are coming in with it and the blockchain and the cyber physical, like much more detailed than just sort of a broad like carbon credits or social credit scoring. And it's a lot to take in. um, I understand that, and it takes time because essentially it involves imagining the world in a totally different way, and in a way that, like, I think if you watch a lot of TV, you can probably figure it out. But they lay it all out in the TV shows. I don't watch TV, but I have watched some Black Mirror episodes, and so it's really not that hard to imagine. But I guess just wrapping your mind around the fact that it could be very real. And for me, the when all of the lockdowns happened early on, I thought, oh, I have this additional information about these finance markets and these human capital markets and blockchain, um, that'll get added to the conversation, and that I'm just a little nobody, but people who have bigger platforms, they'll be able to sort of pick it up and run with the story and incorporate that into their analysis. And that never happened. And I gave about a year, and then you sort of see how people work, and then it still didn't happen. And so, I'm kind of tired. And it's not sinking in. It's not sinking in not only just for the regular people, but even the resistance people. It's not sinking in. And at one point, sort of the middle of the day, I had shared some information about these. Uh, Essentially, it's a blockchain program for grants. And I've been looking at this for a long time. I put out a tweet. I said something to the effect of, so picture this blockchain grant program, but picture like the Gates Foundation or Chan Zuckerberg as a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, and then it's plugged into a smart environment, a home, a city, one of these charter city towns, and it's coded with values, and these interactions just happen, right? Like these automated payments start happening, and there's no one in charge of the foundation anymore. It's just running as a machine. It's an incorporated machine that's running the world. And I said, hey, this is it, right? Like there's a white paper. It's called Giving Unchained, and it was from 2015. It's like, so I probably caught up with it about 2017. But I'm like, okay, this is how it's going to work. And then, I've written extensively in the past about Hewlett Packard and Hewlett Packard remaking the nonprofit industrial complex to be data driven. And so, I have that whole piece, and, hardly anybody talks about Hewlett Packard, but Hewlett Packard is a really big deal. And their role in the nonprofit space and the educational technology space. And then, I did a whole nother write-up. Again, this is like 2018, about the MacArthur Foundation and funding for these international pilots with the Nudge Unit and Syrian refugees and IBM and Sesame Workshop. And, essentially they had done this big prize, and it was Sesame Workshop won, but one of the other, it was like this $100 million and change project. The project that won was going to get $100 million, and it was the International Rescue Commission, and they were targeting refugees. And I had to write this whole piece saying, hey, Sesame Street is not what you think, and the MacArthur Foundation is not good. These Genius Awards are not good, and all of the applications that had made it up to like the semifinalist level, but they didn't win. But there were several hundred. They all went into a data bank over at Penn, which, I'm here in Philly, and Penn is central to all of this. And, why did they go into this? It was like the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. All of those projects, their social impact finance projects, went over to there. And it's because they're in the holding pen. They're in the holding pen for the infrastructure to happen, for the digital identity to scale, for us to normalize, cyber physical environments, and the narrative needs to be spun that this is for the good of the commons, and the leftists need to bring brought on board, and a lot of the services will be provided by faith-based institutions. So, the conservatives will be brought in. And so that's really what I was trying to do in the piece that I put together. Literally, I mean, it's probably about 50 pages of text. It's about 100 pages with all of the supporting images, because I think often images really convey the reality of it. And, you know, yeah, Protocol Labs was out there saying essentially they've got the platform, like they've got it. And sure, this video, it only had, 80 views. But the people who are involved in that organization have ties to Microsoft, and they have high ties to Radical Exchange, which is advancing the soulbound token papers. And like, I don't really care if the video only has 80 views. Like, maybe they only wanted to have 80 views. Like, that's the thing. But I know what the infrastructure is, and I know that these people are connected. And actually, Protocol Labs is being funded out of Berlin, which is where they're working a lot with cyber physical systems. And I just had someone who was like, "Oh, no, that's not a big deal. Like, look at their token chart. It's like really nothing. It's like not a big deal." And I'm just like, "No, trust me. Could you trust me that I know what I'm talking about? Like, I know that this is wrong and it's moving." And literally, like, I put and I'm not trying to make this, but like a month of my time into trying to knit this together. And I get one person, like actually two people who had substantive things to say, but like they have my email. So they were sharing it through email, but like, it was like throwing in a hole, like literally throwing in a hole. And, yeah, so that was all going on. Like, clearly people are not getting it. And then I had actually ordered this book. So it's called Beyond the Box. It's about B.F. Skinner. And it's exactly what I'm talking about. It's turning the world into a Skinner box. And it's going to be embedded, like the way I keep talking about with the digital twins, such that, through weaponized narrative, through weaponized frequency, like people are not even going to realize that they're being controlled by their twins and by these simulations. And sure, maybe that's already happening. Like maybe we don't have full autonomy, but I want to believe we still do. And this is running. This is off to the races, and they're getting both sides, the right and the left, to come on board and to do this stuff. And I guess what I realized, because I've noticed like my engagement going way down on Twitter. Like, I got off of Facebook. That was a really bad scene. And at the same time, I'm like, I'm chucking the Telegram because I'm not going to do that. And I'm really just going to, yeah, sure. Like, I have my YouTube channel and I have a blog, and some people critique me for having YouTube. It's what I had. Like, you can go back and see my history from when I was just like a mom showing up at the school board, right? And it's mine, right? It's my space. I'm not really believing anything that these blockchain spaces are any better, really. And in fact, they're working on getting the interoperability. So whatever, it's the tools that I have. It's what I started with in 2016 when I got into this. And so I'm just pruning back, and I don't know if I'll go back to Twitter, because when I'm realizing it is the Skinner box. It literally is the Skinner box. And like, they want you to engage on this platform, and you're not. And granted, I told Jason, I said, like, it's fair because I block a lot of people, right? And so it could be that people are very hesitant to participate because they don't want to get blocked. So that's fair enough. Like, I will own that. I will own that as part of my bad behaviors. Like, right? Like, maybe I need my own behavior modification program. But like, yeah, no, it's not. Like, even people who are really close to me, people I worked with very closely for years, never retweet my material. Like, never. Anything else, yeah, sure, fine. Like, it's all getting retweeted, but not the stuff that I share, like that I actually try to pour and it may not be right. Like, I'm learning every day. I'm adding new stuff. I'm getting more and more in touch with, like, today it was deonatic logic. Like, please, like, I put out an ask. If anybody's out there who is interested in writing a paper about deonatic logic, DEONTIC, it's all about permissions and obligations and reciprocity. And it's going to be baked into the smart contracts. It's going to be part of all these stupid soulbound token systems. So like, I need for someone, I can't do all the things, like dive in, because I don't know anything about it other than like, I know it's all connected, and like make some sense out of it. And I will put it on like my platform. I don't know. Somebody just sent like a terrible thing to Jason this week, like terrible. Like, and again, like, I know from my friend Cliff, it's not really about me. It's really about what they're listening to, but about like me being a narcissist, or I'm just here to do this because like I have some unmet need. I'm doing it because I really feel like someone has put like this has been put on my heart to try to tell a story. I'm not trying to be like, I would love to be more collaborative. I would love for people to be able to like take responsibility for the 2.5 years, like solid, that I've been putting information into the space and say, like, this is how I see this. This is how it reflects in my life because it's every single thing. Like, it's housing, it's addiction, it's schools, it's healthcare, it's food, it's smart cities, it's justice, it's democracy. Like, it's every single bit of the world, like that you can imagine. So anybody could hook into it and say, like, I have a friend whose world is lumber. Like, it's gonna affect the forests. Like, get your piece and tell that. Like, that's how we need to translate it. I'm not saying I have a lock on how to tell the story, like how to do it the right way. All I can do is the way I do it, which is long form and difficult, right? So, like, I need people to sing it. I need people to do poems. I need people to tell their side. I need to read like heartfelt letters or poems or whatever you can do, because we have to, like, I need some feedback that it's actually like people are owning the information and then making sense out of it in their own way and adding to it, because I have stuff to learn. I totally have stuff to learn from other people. And so, like, at this point, like, part of me being off of Facebook, even being on Twitter, I didn't follow anybody. I had like a handful of people that I check in on, but like, I didn't want to have the distraction of the noise to derail me off of this job that I felt like I have. And in the moment right now, it is looking at California and eugenics. And then this spun into this huge chunk that was about actually displaced people, which I'm connecting to say, like, the displaced people, sure, these are international, these are immigrants, these are people who are put on the move for economic warfare, actual warfare, all sorts of things. But those displaced people are the unhoused people of our world. They're the elderly of our world. They're all of the people who are going to be pushed around to create the information economy, to create the data economy. That's what's coming, is all of this data. And they need those mobile people, but they need them to be tagged and traced and tracked and monitored through the Skinner box behaviors. So I got that off my chest. Like, I would say, I don't know if I'm going to go back to Twitter because it's not serving me. Like, it's not serving it's making me really angry and frustrated with people, which is not what I want. So maybe this is how I'll be communicating more, as because I don't, at this point, like, the stuff I talk about, they figure nobody's cares about. Like, even though it's like the crux of the matter, it's not on so far the AI isn't like clamping down on this stuff. So, find me here, follow my blog. If you have something beyond a like random video to share from another person, like, I have my emails on my blog. And so as much as I would like, I have tons of books. Like, this is my summer. Like, I've got all of these books. I've got to read about the Quakers. I've got to read about cycles. I've got to read about metaphysics and color and learning theory and the stupid box. So maybe it's good that I'm not going to be distracted by other stuff. But yeah, so that's where I'm at. But if you want to stick with me, instead of, I know I need to get back to Wrinkle in Time, I haven't been up for it. This has been really heavy, like trying to, and I'm not trying to complain, but like absorb all these materials, like read the white papers, read dissertations, make sense of it. And it's horrible. Like, it's really, it's a lot. And so I needed to organize it. So I didn't have to think about it anymore. So I could just push it out. So that's why I've been really trying to do this part. And I don't know, like, maybe when I'm done with the California stuff, I'll take a break for a while, and I have some quilts to make. I am hoping that, Jason and I have talked about going to California in maybe October. So if, there's a lot of, I haven't been doing my dandelion stuff this summer because honestly, I've been feeling like a hermit. And it's not good for my health, probably. So I want to get out. Who knows? I don't know how crazy California will be by this fall, but I want to see the missions. I want to see Caltech. I want to see Esalen. I want to see the Bay Area, Los Angeles. I want to like go to these places and talk about them in the place. But I'd also love to talk to people. And I realize like I'm not the popular kid right now. Like, I'm not the blockchain. Like there can be the good blockchain, and there can be the good crypto card games. And I'm not, let me tell you about a bioweapon. Like none of that is me. None of that is me. But I would be happy to connect with people. Like we're going to try to put together, I don't know, like camping and some Airbnbs and, whatever. Jason has a van and, if there's people who might want to talk to us, like, well, come talk. I can say for sure, like we're hitting up San Diego and LA and the Bay Area and stuff in between. I really kind of want to go see the petroglyphs near China Lake. So anyway, like that's on the horizon. Like I'm hoping that, and maybe that's what it needs to be, that it's not stupid Twitter wars. But anyway, so I am going to just take some time, and this is probably going to be really boring for people, so don't feel like you have to stick around. But this book is important because literally they're putting us in a Skinner box world, and it's going to be the dislocated people first. And I think I do think in this space there's a lot that's going to be connected to Central America and the border, and like trying to understand on both sides that the dislocated people aren't the problems, because within this new virtual world, put your brain in a robot, they can, like, the economic threat is going to be everywhere. So we're not each other's economic threat. Like we need to actually organize together globally and understand. It's having people on the move is what's driving the stupid non-rival goods and the creation of the metaverse. So anyway, so I ordered this book about B.F. Skinner, and maybe I'll link to it in the comments. But last summer when I was coming back from New York, there's a sweet little boy, and he gave me this one dandelion, and it was a homeschool kid. And I was like, I'm like unschooled, right? And I'm going, I'm going to go take this to B.F. Skinner's hometown, because when I was driving up, I guess it was 81 through Pennsylvania, Susquehanna, Pennsylvania is B.F. Skinner's hometown. It's right on the border of Pennsylvania and up in New York. And so when I got there, I was like, I'm just going to pull off, and I'm going to take this dandelion, and I'm going to find his house and leave this dandelion. And so I'm driving in, like it was maybe 10 miles off the highway, and I'm driving down the road, and I see these signs for, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like big signs. And I thought, because I know that's a big piece of this too. Not exclusively, there are many pieces. Like the last piece I just wrote on was a whole lot about the Jesuits, but like, wow. So that's that. And I couldn't believe it. So I pulled over, and there was like a big church and a parking lot and a cemetery. And I pulled into the cemetery. And what I realized is, like, right outside of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania is where, the Joseph Smith interpreted the golden tablets for the Book of Mormon is in the same town. Now, what are the odds? Like, what are the odds? It's just too crazy. And I think like their first baptism was in the Susquehanna River, which is actually, what is his name? Michael Wan. He has like the Susquehanna alchemy. He has a lot about the history and the significance of the Susquehanna River. But I had no idea that this was an overlap. So B.F. Skinner, later was a professor of behaviorism at Harvard, and he worked with rats and pigeons. And he actually did this pigeon project during World War II, and he got funding from Vannevar Bush to teach pigeons who were in harnesses, like all tied up, to like peck and steer missiles. It was going to be the first guided missile system. Like they would stick a pigeon in a missile and have it remote guided by the pigeon pecking to steer the damn missile. Like that's the stuff he was. Now, I don't know that it was ever actually deployed, and I think a lot of people made fun of it, but he developed these Skinner boxes. And actually what he also developed was a machine that would track, like when each peck, or with the rabbits, they would depress a lever to get a food pellet, and it would track all of those movements, and it would chart like an EEG kind of up and down graph. And it was like this permanent record of the behavior. And that there's actually anyway, I talk about it in the video that I did, but that's blockchain, people. That's your blockchain idea, is your permanent record. It's exactly a direct link back to what Skinner was doing with tracking behavior and operant conditioning. Like, this is how you have to do it. And so we're going to have a permanent record that's going to feed into these feedback loops. And so I feel really strongly that there's this connection between programming people through faith traditions, programming people through academic structures, programming people like machines, like treating animals like machines, treating people like machines. And so, I'm just, when I bought this book, I thought it was a critique. Like, I thought that this woman was critiquing the idea that Skinner, because he essentially had these boxes that he would work with the animals in. But since he worked with small animals, they didn't come out of the box. They just stayed in the box. And but people took his research in behaviorism and operant conditioning and then applied them to larger animals, and then eventually to people in mental institutions and in preschools. And so now it's going to be all of us in these crazy charter cities with cyber physical systems run on token economies. So anyway, I am going to read 2 of these chapters. And again, I'm not expecting, there's like 38 of you to like necessarily sit here and listen to me read this, but this is really important information. And it links to what I was trying to communicate around refugees, programming, wellness behaviors, optimization, machines, tokens, and these records. It's all connected, and it all goes back to Skinner. And so I find it really hard when I see these sort of like thought leaders or academics or people in the space talking about things out of any historic context, like they didn't know where it came from. Like, oh, we just showed up. We don't know anything about Skinner, and it didn't die. Like, literally, behavioral economics is embedded into the Skinnerian system, into the cybernetics, which Jason and I have been like pounding on about for a really long time, is this homeostasis and these reinforcement mechanisms and governance and governors and machines. It is all of that. So there's 2 chapters. This is chapter 2 and chapter 3. So I'm just going to read them out loud. Eventually I'll get back to Wrinkle in Time, I promise, but I'm just not in a good headspace for love, which I feel like I need to be in the right frame of mind to talk about that. So, okay. So chapter 2 is called From Pigeons to People, Constructing the Human Skinner Box. This is a quote. I certainly do not recommend working with the fewest possible animals. On the other hand, there are important strategic decisions to be made. Human behavior is the subject of greatest interest, and if I had the facilities, I should have used species closer to it than rat or pigeon. But I should not have felt it necessary to cover the waterfront any more than an immunologist would feel it necessary to cover immunological processes in a very large number of species. Now, this is sort of an academic-y book, so it might be a little dry, but it's important, trust me. Okay. For critics, the fact that Skinner's own basic experimental work was conducted almost exclusively with rats and pigeons in the rigidly controlled environment of the operant chamber became problematic when he and his followers extended his principles to the problems of human beings in the real world. Some were skeptical on purely scientific grounds, arguing that without the appropriate studies, Skinner could not assume that his findings would replicate with humans under very different conditions. Others had a more emotional reaction. These critics objected to the implied equivalence of lower organisms and human beings that they discerned in Skinner's work. For example, one aspiring poet parodied Skinner in verse. Dr. Skinner took a rat, and in his easy chair he sat, and held the rodent on his knees, and gave each little paw a squeeze, and said, "Oh, mirror of mankind, whose ways so accurately I find reflect the masses, yet I say, not every man behaves that way, for some, in matters of religion, most nearly imitate the pigeon." Okay, so that's the poem. Despite the fact that Skinner himself never undertook an experimental analysis of human behavior, several of his colleagues and students did construct analogs of the operant chamber for use with human subjects. In essence, these researchers created human-sized Skinner boxes, complete with manipulanda, delivery chutes, reinforcers, and cumulative recorders. That's the machine, the cumulative recorder. These men, largely, who were familiar with Skinner's basic methods and envisioned how to apply them to the scientific study of human behavior. If Skinner's system had in fact proceeded linearly from basic research with animals to basic research with humans to human application, these men would be responsible for bridging Skinner's experimental principles with animals to applied work with humans. As we shall see, however, this process did not proceed linearly, and the relations between the experimentalists and the behavior shapers, as they became known in the popular press, were in many cases somewhat distant. In this chapter, I surveyed 3 examples of work undertaken inside human-sized Skinner boxes. In each example, the ultimate goals for the researcher were observation, measurement, and recording of human behavior, not behavior change. However, through such projects, the Skinner box expanded both physically and conceptually. Although these researchers remained within the box, so to speak, they did take a few tentative steps beyond the box and either intentionally or unintentionally moved Skinner's system closer to the realm of full-blown application. In discussing their work, I also moved this account beyond the box by moving beyond Skinner himself to focus on those who worked with him and were influenced by him. First, I discussed Charles Foerster's work with autistic children at the Indiana University Medical Center. And then I move on to Ogden Lindsley's research with chronic schizophrenics at the Metropolitan State Hospital. And finally, in moving ever closer to applied work, I survey Sidney Bijou's studies of child behavior in his mobile child study laboratory. Each of these men extended the use of the free operant method to human beings by constructing rooms that closely resembled the operant chambers used in experiments with pigeons and rats. Although there are many other examples of work in human-sized Skinner boxes, these 3 case studies demonstrate that Skinner's neglect of the area did not deter other researchers from employing humans as their subject of greatest interest. In one particularly bizarre study, human subjects were led with no instructions into a cubicle where they had to press a lever to delay the onset of an electric shock. Instead of lever pressing, half the subjects chose instead to disconnect the electrodes and walk out of the experiment, arguably a more effective avoidance procedure. Although this body of research established a tradition of basic studies of human operant behavior, this tradition was soon overshadowed by the dominance of applied behavior analysis through the 1960s and 1970s. However, the area experienced a renaissance in the 1980s. The experimental analysis of human behavior, or EAHB, has now been institutionalized as a special interest group of the burgeoning Association for Behavior Analysis International. But well before this, in their efforts to, quote, cover the waterfront, Skinnerian researchers selected many species for experimentation in operant chambers or similar kinds of apparatus, including dogs, primates, and even goldfish. Prior to working with humans, Skinner's colleague, Charles Foerster, spent 2 years working with chimpanzees at the Yerkes Laboratories of Primate Biology in Orange Park, Florida. Although Foerster's time at Orange Park was controversial, his studies there did extend findings on schedules of reinforcement in pigeons to a species closer to our own. As Skinner remarked in a letter written soon after Foerster arrived at Orange Park, quote, "All this stuff about the chimp sounds fascinating, and I look forward to further reports." An examination of Foerster's work over the first decade of his career reveals a progression from pigeon to chimpanzee to human being using the free operant method at the physically expanding Skinner box to extend the operant project. Skinner and Foerster met at Skinner's influential Pigeon Lab and were good friends until Foerster's untimely death in 1981 at the age of 59. Charles Foerster was a 27-year-old graduate student at Columbia University in the fall of 1949. Now remember, Columbia University, the Industrial School of Engineering, was where all of the technocracy work was done, a lot of it in the 30s. So in 1949, when he first heard about the opportunity to work with Skinner, Columbia was a natural place for Skinner to come looking for help. The university was a hotbed of operant psychology. Fred Keller, Skinner's colleague and close friend since their graduate school days at Harvard, was on faculty there and had just completed his seminal text, Principles of Psychology, with Nat Schoenfeld. Under the influence, a bevy of students had become fascinated with the operant approach. As Foerster later recalled of the atmosphere at Columbia, everyone had conditioned a rat, had read Walden too, and most were impatient to try out the science of behavior. Some students fantasized a new institute for operant behavior, and others dreamed of an actual planned community modeled after Walden too. So when Foerster heard that Skinner was looking for a researcher to join his team, he immediately made an appointment for an interview and hopped on the midnight train from New York to Boston. Arriving at 6 a.m, he wandered around Harvard Square nervously until what he thought was a respectable hour to appear at Skinner's office. And after a casual meeting consisting of sodas and a tour of the labyrinthine basement of Memorial Hall, Foerster was hired and asked to return February 1st to become an official staff member of the Pigeon Lab. He rushed back to Columbia, executed some rather hurried dissertation research to meet the deadline, and arrived at Harvard in the winter of 1950 to take up his post. Foerster's initial weeks at the laboratory were consumed with adjusting equipment, tweaking experimental procedures, examining data, and organizing the incredible array of tools, parts, devices, and gadgets that served the needs of the lab members. Because the lab was set up to record the cumulative rates of pigeon pecking in dozens of operant chambers, most of the daily discussions in grand rounds centered around apparatus design and construction. All experimental sessions were completely automated and could last up to 10 hours. Over time, each cumulative recorder had to stand up to literally billions of pigeon pecks. Thousands of feet of cumulative curves were generated. And as Foerster emphasized in a matter reminiscent of Skinner's 1956 case study in Scientific Method, the physical arrangements of the laboratory, the supplies, the equipment, and the shop were important factors in determining the kind of research that went on. Indeed, this experience constructing and servicing cumulative recorders, programmers, and food magazines in well-stocked and physically reinforcing laboratory environment influenced Foerster more than he realized at the time. He later remarked that it taught him how to run a laboratory, how to design experiments, and how to actually conceptualize research problems. Not surprisingly, Foerster would use the Pigeon Lab experiments as models for his future work with primates and human subjects. And so I just want to reinforce the whole aspect of the behaviorist performance and the food access. That's really, really important. And I know Leo has been doing a lot of work in his series focusing on Cello with the food, the FAO, the UN food program, and how it's all connected. And, early on in my work with blockchain, these early use cases were managing refugees with their biometrics to be able to access food payments through their retinal scans. So again, behavioral compliance linked to food access. And, in that, the thought experiment in the state of Illinois task force for blockchain, again, as a thought experiment, they hadn't deployed it yet, but using SNAP benefits, which are food stamps, and attaching it to behaviorist components, like that you had to choose the right food to be incentivized to get token economies back for reinforcement. So these are all you look at all of these programs and they don't say that this is where they're if they were just honest, right? I know that's Jason's channel, right? If we were honest, if these people were actually honest and they would say, oh, well, going back to Skinner, we felt like this was a really good conditioning behavior with the pigeons and the rats, then people could have a clearer understanding of what was going on and what's going on, and that we're being treated as laboratory animals. And many people for a long time have been treated that way, but they're not honest. They just pretend like somehow this just came out of nowhere. This is just a brand new grand design for blockchain systems and tokenized payments. And I will say, when I was doing my education research, and this comes in later with the token economies, that they were developing these things called red critter. It was actually, there were two levels, a school-based one and a corporate environment one, where it was a behavioral compliance app and they had wearables, like you would wear like a wristband, and the teacher, or I guess the boss, like they would zing you behavior tokens, like in the classroom. If you were behaving properly, they would zing you tokens. And so this, like no one says, by the way, this token economy, this stuff, Google Classcraft or Red Trigger Critter or PBIS or tickets or whatever, like this is the history. This comes out of, I mean, because the Pigeon Project was connected very directly to World War, like pre-World War II, because we weren't even supposed to be in the war at that time, like preparations for World War II military experimentation, literally these pigeons to direct bombs. And nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about that. So, okay. So the Orange Park primate experience. After what he described as an intense and rewarding 5-year collaboration with Skinner, which resulted in their co-authored book, Schedules of Reinforcement, Foerster accepted an invitation facilitated by Karl Pribram. Now, I think that Pribram is mentioned in the Holographic Universe book, and I need to look that up again, but that's a really good book if you haven't read it yet. To work at the Yerkes Laboratories of Primate Biology in Orange Park, Florida. Here was a chance to apply what he had learned in the Pigeon Lab to the study of primate behavior. He arrived in July of 1955, immediately after Henry Nissen had assumed directorship of the facility. Foerster quickly added 2 staff members to his team, Roger Kelleher and John Falk, and the trio conducted a series of studies on schedules of reinforcement, conditioned reinforcement, and discrimination learning in chimpanzees. The experimental procedures they devised for working with the chimps drew heavily on Foerster's experience in the Pigeon Lab, and orders for equipment to construct experimental spaces for the primates were frequent. In one published report, Foerster remarked of the methodological similarities. The specific experimental conditions were similar to those already described for the pigeon, although they were presumably executed on a somewhat larger scale. Instead of pecking a key to get grain, the chimps would press a key to get a portion of chow. And at one point, Foerster became nostalgic for, quote unquote, the old days when the subject could be lifted out of the operant chamber. The importation of some of the Pigeon Lab methods, however, met with resistance. Of considerable controversy was the practice of using food deprivation to increase the chimps' motivation to work on the reinforcement schedules. At Orange Park, Foerster and his operant colleagues typically reduced the chimps to 80% of free feeding weight in order to get them to work. This had been standard practice in the Pigeon Lab. Most non-operant researchers, however, felt that this was both unnecessary and inhumane. For his part, Foerster felt that some of the practices used by the other scientists at the Yerkes Lab were themselves misguided. In a letter to Skinner, written a few months after his arrival, Foerster noted, and this is a quote, "As usual, the techniques of handling animals involved aversive control exclusively, a stream of water from a hose, a toy soaked in kerosene at the end of a stick, are frequently used to get them in a small carrying crate for weighing on the big scale, for example. My animals compete to get into the box. However, something as simple as putting food in a box can elude them. I can't conceive. I think it's the pure enjoyment of punishing the animals that makes them use aversive control." All right. So, yeah, I mean, I think the forced labor component is something that we have to reckon with. Like, I mean, this is part of, what I've been trying to lay out on my series about California and the eugenics history is that, a lot of the eugenics, while yes, for sure, it had a racialized component, a lot of it was labeling people who were not felt to be pulling their own economic weight and who were, quote unquote, feeble-minded or non-compliant with the protocol. And this was happening during the years of the Great Depression, that people were being forcibly sterilized as sort of essentially a drag on the rest of society, that they weren't able to fulfill their economic obligations. And then that in turn was magnified by the Nazis. And so, but it started in California as progressive, socially progressive practice. So I think when we're talking about withholding food and the gorillas, that's really important. Like, this didn't go away. And this is the same as this thought experiment in the state of Illinois, putting SNAP and then pulling back money if people are making food choices someone else has decided are inappropriate, especially as I think we move towards precision nutrition and forcible using food to terraform people or to manage their gut microbiome and therefore manage how their mind works. Okay. Despite the friction between the operant and non-operant scientists, it was an intensely productive period for Foerster's group, resulting in about a dozen published articles over the course of his short tenure there. And in the end, deteriorating collegial relationships prompted a move, and Foerster left Orange Park in the summer of 1957, effectively ending the brief period of operant psychology at the monkey farm. Okay. So this is the next subsection, from chimps to children. From 1957 until 1962, Foerster worked at Indiana University Medical Center, where he took a position at the Institute of Psychiatric Research as a professor and a principal investigator of experimental psychology. At Indiana, he finally had the opportunity to work with human beings. His subjects were autistic children hospitalized at the Institute. After his tenure at the pigeon and primate labs, how did Foerster conceptualize his research programs when working with humans? In what had now become standard operating procedure, Foerster decided to investigate operant behavior in autistic children by importing the techniques of food deprivation, key pressing, automated reinforcer delivery, and continuous measurement that he had used in his previous work. But given that these were children and not chimps, how was food deprivation operationalized? Yes, Mr. Foerster. Still convinced that deprivation was necessary to motivate responding, he explained in one research report that it was accomplished by denying children snacks between meals. Okay, so I would say this, like, in doing my research, and I've written a blog post that was about, it's called Minding Our Health. You should look it up, like on Wrenching the Gears, Minding Our Health, and it's about digital nudges. And this is connected to Penn and the Center for Health Behavior Economics. And so again, it is very much about nudging for wellness. And what I didn't realize, this institute is connected with the Penn Health System, but then also Wharton, is that Wharton, which is again here connected to the University of Pennsylvania, the business school, had very close ties to Tavistock, which is psychological engineering. So look up, if you want to know more, like put in nudging in the search engine of my blog, wrenchinthegears.com, and it will come up. But what they were talking about in terms of that negative reinforcement is always like stronger than positive reinforcement. So like food deprivation would be a negative reinforcement. Okay. Okay, so they don't get snacks. All right. The experimental design space designed for research with these children was a room containing a variety of devices necessary for free operant method, a response console where the child subject could press a key and receive a coin, a number of vending machines where a child could deposit coins and receive a variety of reinforcers, and a matching to sample apparatus. Along one wall was a one-way mirror for observation. And in a typical experiment, each child was oriented to the room by an attendant and then was left there alone during the entire experimental procedure, which lasted from 1 to 3 hours. So you can imagine an autistic kid left alone in a room for 3 hours. Okay, depending on the subject. There were no exceptions to this practice except during the most extreme tantrums. One unintended outcome was that when a child was, quote, locked in the experimental space daily for over a year, the frequency of tantrums and atavism declined continuously until they almost disappeared. Foerster took this as a convincing proof of the operant nature of several autistic behaviors, with social attention serving as a reinforcer for the child's natural environment. In terms of key pressing, Foerster explicitly compared the children's performance to the performance of other species. When coins were delivered by pressing a simple key, the pattern of emission of the child's behavior was like that normally occurring under similar reinforcement conditions in other species. As in the pigeon and primate labs, graphic records of cumulative curves were generated and examined. The results, according to one report, showed that it was possible to bring the behavior of these children under close control of an artificial environment, indicating that despite their deficits, autistic children were not much different from pigeons and chimps in their ability to generate lawful response rates. Also, not unlike his previous subjects, the children were tested extensively, sometimes spending over 200 sessions in the room-size Skinner box. 200 sessions. I mean, that's really intense. That's like really crazy. And I want to point out, like when they're talking about the Skinner box recorders, and I need to go further into this, but I have been reading I was very intrigued by this book. This is Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religion by Joseph Farrell. And I haven't read it all, and I think maybe it gets a little more extreme, but the first chapter here is on the foundation for the study of cycles. And that is really important, this foundation for the study of cycles, because what they were doing is, like, during the 30s, trying to figure out what happened with the Depression, studying all sorts of cycles, rhythmic cycles, and then talking about using cycles to harmonize things. So the lines of this, the cumulative record, are cycles in and of themselves. Okay. Okay. 200 sessions in the Skinner box. Forster concluded his reports of these experimental analyses with firm statements about the basic rather than applied nature of the work. We do not consider these techniques as attempts at rehabilitation, but rather as an experimental analyses of the actual and potential repertoires of these children. And this experimental program is not viewed as an attempt at carrying out psychotherapy. Nonetheless, he did indicate that results might prove useful in efforts to develop increased social behaviors in the children, but they're locked alone in a room. Or at baseline measurements to evaluate drug effects. The latter technique, in fact, was being used by another Pigeon Lab alumnus, Ogden Lindsley. Ogden Lindsley, Dogs, Drugs, and Rates of Response. Ogden Lindsley was a frequent participant in the Pigeon staff meetings from 1951 to 1964. Okay, so that's like 13 years. First as a graduate student and then as a postdoctoral researcher. As he later put it, much, much more than pigeon research happened, I'm sure, in the West End of Harvard's Memorial Hall basement in the early 1950s. Lindsley entered psychology after a harrowing experience as a German prisoner of war, whereupon he vowed to spend the rest of his life having fun and studying people. Okay. But for Lindsley, as for Forster, research with people did not happen right away. For his dissertation with Skinner, Lindsley designed and built the first Skinner box for dogs. To get him started on his dissertation research, Skinner directed Lindsley to Walter Jeter at the Boston University Medical School, who held a grant from the Atomic Energy Commission. Okay, so this is like the radio eugenic stuff again. To study the effects of irradiation on the physiology, exercise, and behavior of beagles. To study the effects of irradiation on behavior, Lindsley designed an operant chamber in which the dogs were required to paw press a panel for portions of raw hamburger. Using 63 two-year-old male beagles, Lindsley established a reliable variable interval response rate and then taught the dogs to stop pressing the panel when a light flashed and when a buzzer signaled an adversely loud horn blast. He then examined the effects of various dogs on the operant response rates, visual discrimination, and condition suppression that he had established. After the effects of varying doses of alcohol, Nembutal, and methamphetamines were established for calibration purposes, the dogs were subjected to total body irradiation at a level that killed half of them over the period of 15 days as their white blood cell counts decreased. Lindsley later remarked of the dog's demise, invading organisms go through a live mammal so fast when there's no white cells, you can't believe it. Lindsley, 2004 interview with the author. The other half of the dogs recovered gradually. Both groups were extensively tested immediately after irradiation and over the 15-day period, not only for the effects of the irradiation on their operant behavior, but also on their maze running performance. Lindsley found that physically ill dogs demonstrated lower response rates, but well-preserved visual discrimination and conditioned suppression. Although the practical implications of these findings were not clear, right? Lindsley felt the beagle experiments were personally worthwhile. From our free operant research, I was strongly rewarded for apparatus design and procedure innovation. I had introduced a new species to the free operant, and this strengthened my resolve to use the free operant with people. Despite his enthusiasm for the beagle work, Lindsley was still more interested in human than dog behavior. His opportunity to study humans came again as a result of Skinner's connections. During the course of their meeting to discuss Lindsley's dissertation research, they often strayed from the topic of beagle behavior to the topic of schizophrenia. And Lindsley became fascinated by the possible operant nature of psychotic behavior, as he reported in this retrospective account. Quote, fascinated, I promised Fred that if he could get the funds, I would give human free operant research with psychotics 5 years of my life. If it didn't pan out, my parachute plan was to go to Ringling Brothers Circus and shape the Gargantua, the gorilla, to play piano and simple card games. And I ended up spending 11 and a half years studying psychotics from the back wards of Metropolitan State Hospital. In 1952, Skinner met Harry Solomon, head of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard and director of the Boston Psychopathic Hospital. Solomon was known to be theoretically open-minded, even though psychoanalytic thinking was then hegemonic in psychiatry. He was immediately interested in Skinner's proposal to establish a human operant lab to study psychotic behavior. He persuaded William McLaughlin, the superintendent of Metropolitan State Hospital in Waltham, Massachusetts, to give Skinner and his colleagues space for a laboratory. And with a physical location secured, Skinner patched together funds from the Office of Naval Research and the Rockefeller Foundation and the Milton Fund of Harvard University and put Lindsley in charge of the project. In June of 1953, Lindsley's dream of studying people was realized. The, quote, experimental analysis of the behavior of psychotic patients, unquote, set up shop in an abandoned hydrotherapy unit in the basement of the hospital. Lindsley quickly converted the unit into a state-of-the-art experimental space, including 2 6-foot square operant chambers. 6 foot square is not very big. Equipped with a plunger operanda and a magazine delivery chutes designed to administer a variety of reinforcements to human subjects. The plungers were connected through programming relays and timers to cumulative recorders situated in a hallway adjacent to the experimental rooms, which Lindsley came to call Apparatus Alley. Eventually, the lab became known as the Harvard Medical School Behavior Research Laboratory. The early research undertaken at the Behavior Research Laboratory clearly drew upon the free operant method used with other organisms and practiced par excellence in the pigeon lab. In one of the first publications, Lindsley and Skinner described their method of introducing their subjects, male psychiatric patients hospitalized an average of 17 years, to the experimental situation. Patients were brought down to the laboratory and shown a variety of potential reinforcers, including candy, cigarettes, and coins, and they were prompted to select their preferred reinforcer. For some patients, none of these seemed to have any reinforcing value, and so more options were introduced, including projecting short exposures of interesting pictures, actually photos of pinup girls, onto the wall. Subjects were then led into the experimental room where, in the case of severely catatonic patients, they were shown how to operate the plunger that would deliver the reinforcer, or in the case of better functioning patients, were allowed to explore the room freely until the plunger pulling was emitted. And with effective reinforcers established, the operant response was introduced, and 2 schedules of reinforcement were investigated. A 1-minute variable interval schedule in which plunger pulling was reinforced on an average of once a minute, and a fixed ratio of 20 in which every 20th response was reinforced. Skinner and Lindsley concluded that the effects of different schedules of reinforcement on the behavior of their schizophrenic subjects were orderly and similar to those found in rats, pigeons, and dogs. They recommended further study, specifically using the response rates as baselines for investigating the moment-to-moment effects of drugs. So again, I think, if we think about the last 2.5 years in terms of reinforced conditioning and, one of the things I've talked about several times is Martin Seligman and the positive psychology department at Penn. And positive psychology isn't actually positive, very positive. And what Martin Seligman, he actually developed this thing called learned helplessness. And so instead of the reinforcement being regularly scheduled so that people could figure out I have to push it 20 times, I've learned, 19, 20, whatever, now I get my pellet. They would use random things so that you would never know, everything was totally out of your control. And then eventually, I think they had dogs and they were being shocked and the dogs would just give up. They would just give up because they couldn't make any sense. None of their actions resulted in any consistent response rate. And so that's what comes after Skinner is the learned helplessness part. And that's what I feel like these crazy people, the Tavistocks, the Harvard behaviorists, they're trying to figure out how to program us as machines and to get all of that pulled together. So anyway, so back to the book, Drugs and Behavior in the Box. Skinner's direct involvement with the Behavior Research Lab, BRL, waned in the late 1950s. But by this time, Ogden Lindsley had earned his PhD and assumed full directorship of the lab. Funds continued to pour in from the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH. Remember the rats, Mrs. Frisbee and the rats of NIMH, both to support the general operations of BRL and for specific projects. It was not a cheap operation. In a letter to the chief of the Research Grants and Fellowships branch, Philip Sapir, Skinner wrote that the first 2 rooms had cost about $10,000 each to build and equip. And with funds from the NIMH and Lindsley, he hoped to construct 5 additional experimental rooms at the cost of $7,000 each. Skinner justified the expenditures by highlighting the volume of data that could be collected and the relative efficiency and superiority of automatically recorded data over personal observation. And so, like, this is the cumulative recorder. Like this, if I could get through to people about the blockchain is the cumulative recorder in cyber physical systems. That is it. Like what they're after is efficiency of information collection and pattern recognition, both for financial markets and for the simulations and for the games, like whatever game they want to play. Like, and they can come up with infinite numbers of games, and none of them have to actually be grounded in reality, because a lot of them are just happening like in the digiverse, in the metaverse, in mixed reality. And if they can control basic things like the equivalent of being locked in a 6x6 room or getting food or, whatever, like that's a tremendous amount of control. They can play whatever game or tell whatever story that they want to tell. And it all goes back to this. I mean, it probably goes back earlier than this, but I mean, like I keep saying this, I think at least goes back to the mission system, if not like the Roman Empire. But in this phase, in the 20th century phase, it's definitely going back to the Skinnering behaviorists. And again, the National Institutes of Mental Health, like that's like theoretically, I mean, I know Jason always says like money is more complicated. It's not really our money, but like there are resources that were public resources that were going into this that were not going into other things that we actually needed. So, okay. Evidently, Skinner was persuasive. The NIMH grants 2 years of support for BRL, $30,000 for the first year and $20,000 for the second. As Skinner remarked to Harry Solomon upon receiving the news, "Now we're in business." From 1958 to 1965, Lindsley received additional NIMH grants for projects entitled Screening Potential Stimulants on Inactive Psychotics and Drug-Sensitive Free Operant Measures of Psychosis. The late 1950s and early 1960s were truly a golden age for operant research on drug effects. In the last volume of his autobiography, Skinner remarked of this period, quote, "Thanks mainly to Joe Brady, who was actively promoting the experimental analysis of behavior and the assessment and study of drugs, almost all the large ethical pharmaceutical companies had set up operant laboratories. Advertisements for new drugs began to show cumulative recorders, and Life magazine ran a full-page picture in color of an unboxed rat pressing a lever surrounded by racks of relays and timers." Okay, so there we got the pharmaceutical companies. Although the rats in Life were unboxed, the same could not be said of Lindsley's human subjects. In fact, his human-sized Skinner boxes were becoming increasingly elaborate. Lindsley equipped each room with electrical mats to record pacing and mounted voice-operated relays on the ceiling to record vocal hallucinations. In a 1962 article, Lindsley outlined results from 4 case studies investigating both the immediate and chronic effects of 3 drug compounds on plunger pulling behavior, reinforced on 1-minute variable interval schedules. Extensive pre-experimental baseline records were established for each subject in the room-sized Skinner boxes. The effects of the drug compounds were then evaluated according to whether they affected the rate of vocal hallucinatory behavior and plunger pulling. With typical enthusiasm, Lindsley noted, "The technique of direct, continuous, and simultaneous recording of symptomatic and non-symptomatic responding is the most sensitive index we've yet developed for screening psychotherapeutic compounds. The genius lay in the method, and the method was intimately tied into the apparatus." And so I just want to reinforce this. Like, they have mats, they are listening, these are boxes. And I mentioned quite often about these casitas in Austin that I think the company technically went out of business, but these things don't actually go out of business. They just kind of go down low and then they wait till their time comes up because they've got the pilot. But they're like prefab tiny houses they look like fancy freight containers, and their pitch is that like, hey, these are mid-century modern, look how cool this is. That's like a pull-out bed. Look, this has 60 Internet of Things sensors. This house is like living technology. Literally, the shades work. You can like change the colors, the lights, like smart everything. Like it can change your mood. You can change your house to suit your mood, or your house can try to change your mood. I mean, and there's a short story, and I've recommended it in my several times in the articles. It's called On the Domestic Front, and it's in Oxford American magazine. And it literally is about a guy who's in a depressive state, who is being managed by his Internet of Things connected appliances, in a really dark way. And at the end, like he's trying like to commit suicide with his old dryer, because the dryer is like the only appliance that isn't that smart and understands him. So like we're like, and the other thing I will say in terms of the mats and the listening is, I wrote about this in the piece, but I wrote about Sepp Kamvar and the Wildflower Montessori pre-K franchise, and the fact that he was developed that while he was the head of Sepp Kamvar, his invention was acquired by Google. It became Google's PageRank algorithm. And then, he went on, he moved over to MIT and headed up their like social computing group for a while. And at the time he just happened to create like a Montessori pre-K. Only this Montessori pre-K was super high tech, and they would put sensors in the kids' shoes so they could track them around the room and monitor their social behaviors. And then also, which I didn't realize at the time, like they had sensors in the toys and the manipulatives so they could tell what the kids were doing with them. And then they also, and this is Sepp Kamvar is talking about this, had cameras in the ceilings watching the children with artificial vision so that they could actually assess what the children were doing in the classroom, and then upload data onto dashboards, like personal dashboards for children. Like the cameras recognize what individual children were doing and added data. And this is about the seamless recording of data. This is what they've been after since Skinner, and since these cumulative recording, and since smart sensing environments. And, I'm just going to say, like, if anytime you see a Charles Eisenstein post or tweet or somebody sharing his stuff, Charles Eisenstein is an advisor to Cello, which is Sepp Kamvar's programmable enterprise that Leo has been writing about. And like he's using his sacred economic construct to sell an operant condition program that Sepp Kamvar is shilling as beautiful money. Literally, like they have harnessed their brands together. And while like Eisenstein is writing these like really like heartbreaking things about dead fawns and eating their heart and stuff, and like, oh, we love nature and we just are really worried about the digital world, he's literally in like buddy with the people who are building this thing out, like literally building out the Skinner boxes and building out the programmable money that's going to run it. And like I've asked multiple times on Twitter, like, how do you reconcile this? Like how it's not that you don't actually know it, or they're misusing your data, or they've co-opted your concept, because like he's in interviews with Sepp Kamvar and he's listed as an advisor for Cello. So this is just the reality. And I hate that I have to be the one to say these things and like burst people's bubbles. But I mean, granted, Charles Eisenstein went to Yale, so there's that, right? But these brands are developed to lure people in so that you'll just fall all over yourself like, oh yeah, sure, beautiful money. I love beautiful money. And it's not, it's ugly. It's and it goes back to all of this stuff. So, okay. So these are the maps tracking the psychotics. Okay. I'm just trying to see. Okay. So sometimes the apparatus could not withstand the subject's behavior. To overcome the effects of occasional outbursts of violence during the experimental sessions, Lindsley and his colleagues designed indestructible equipment. That's why it's so expensive, I guess. Describing the interior of an experimental room at the end of a 1-hour session during which a violent patient had a destructive episode, Lindsley noted proudly, quote, "The patient broke his chair against the work panel, but did not harm our indestructible panel," close quote. Longevity as well as indestructibility was no doubt an issue. Lindsley's core group of 50 male chronic psychotic patients took part in daily sessions for as long as 10 years. However, in 1965, due to changes in funding practices and increasing expense of running the lab, the BRL closed its doors. During the course of its 11-year tenure, hundreds of students, postdoctoral researchers, and colleagues had visited the lab or conducted research there. And among these visitors and researchers were many who went on to make pioneering contributions in behavioral pharmacology, education, and treatment. Teodoro Ayon and Nathan Azarin, who later collaborated on the first token economy for hospitalized psychiatric patients, both spent time at the lab. Lindsley reported that Sidney Bijou visited BRL in April 1957, November 1961, and April 1962, and went on to build a similar laboratory for children at the University of Washington. Although the BRL was devoted to basic research, it served as a pivotal role in the expansion of behavior analysis beyond its experimental origins. And I would just say, like, look up Ideas 42. Just like take a minute, Google it, look it up. It's behavioral psychology, and it's all linked to social impact finance, climate, UN SDGs, and it was a spin out of Harvard. So again, if it's really hard because we're raised up. I mean, okay, I will not say it's hard for everybody. For people like raised up in sort of middle professional class things, like you're trained to believe like, oh, you want to go to the Ivy League, like these people are really legitimate, like, and then you see what Harvard does. Like you actually see what they do and what they create, right? Because this lab wasn't just about doing the experiments. Literally, it was about building a whole cadre of researchers who would carry this forward. And so, at the time people keep saying, well, they can't all be in on it, or it can't all be a conspiracy. And I'm like, no, it's not like you're all in on it. It's just like you're doing your job. You're trained into doing something, and you're not really held responsible. You're not put in a historic context or a continuum. You just do, oh, here, you're supposed to take the psychotic into the, the experimental chamber and show him like pinup pictures on the wall. Like no one is actually supposed to pull back and look at what the context is, like the history of where it came from, and make a projection of where it's going. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do, is look at the history and then look and see where it's going and say, are we going there? Are we going to run the whole world on a token economy, including like the fungal communication in tree roots? Like we're going to run that on a token economy too? Like, because that's what it seems to be that you're saying. Are we doing that? Is that a humane way to be? Is that what God would want? Like, I don't think so. And so it's the, I guess Jeff Schmidt, he has like this book called Disciplined Minds. And like the soul sucking aspect of being a professional is that you're trained like to be narrow, to do your job and to not think. And then if you're somebody who does question, you get shoved out or you get treated in a really shitty way. And, I don't know how to change that. Like, I don't know institutionally how to change that. I'm not saying I'm out of it. Like literally my husband like works for an institution that's part of all of this. Right. And I have a young adult child who's, part of the reason I'm trying to speak out is because I don't really see many good options. Like I think in the past you might be like, well, there's a lot of ways you could fall into the trap, but there's some other good things like, oh, do this profession or that profession. Like you could still actually have a soul and contribute to society. And I'm increasingly feeling like the way I see it, that's going to be really, really hard. Now, maybe people who have already like agreed to mixed reality life, that's the future, then maybe they'll feel like that there are more options. And I'm trying to say this now because I feel like it isn't fully locked in yet. And if we put it in the context, in the historic context, rather than focusing on whatever current moment polarizing bullshit that's out there, like, social emotional learning, it's behaviorism, but it's not leftist behaviorism. They're making it leftist so that like they can make the left and the right mad at each other. But it's about Skinner. If we zoom back to 1955 and realize it's Harvard, and that realize that there's markets in behavior change and markets in managed behavior, then maybe we get somewhere, right? Like then maybe it doesn't have to be a left-right conversation. Then maybe it can be a morality conversation. Like, are we doing this? Are we creating markets and behavior change? And what does that mean? Because, maybe one group will say like, well, I think programming people is fine as long as they're programming them the way I want them programmed. Like as long as I'm the one running the program and I just have this exchange yesterday. It was really frustrating. Somebody I don't really even know, but I was like, it was like it wasn't even blind copied. The person should have blind copied, but it was like a copy many people thing about some legislation that's proposed in Pennsylvania. I guess I didn't read the whole legislation, but the way it was presented was to label sexually explicit books and have parents have a chance to, have some input. And the person was like, fight this legislation. This is the librarians fight. And like, I'm just done with the librarians, because the librarians literally are just asleep at the wheel on all of this. And they're going to be the center for these mixed media badge makerspace centers, and I'm in Philly. Literally, if there's 10 functioning libraries in our school district of several hundred schools, that would be a shocker. And even the ones that actually have libraries don't have paid librarians. And most of their quote unquote libraries are at this point like milk crates full of used paperbacks, right? So this exchange, and this was my frustration, because I even remember as a parent, because I loved books, I read books. Now, again, I guess books are also programming, right? So I will just say that. But like, I hoovered up books as a kid. I loved them. And we had a wonderful librarian who would just like know all the kids and like suggest things, not force things on you. But when my child went to a good, like it was a public school, but it was like the good one, right? In kindergarten, literally they had all the books were leveled and they all had stickers on them and colors and letters. And you could only choose the books that were like in your section. You couldn't choose a higher level book. You had to prove that you'd earn the right to read the next up level book. And, my kid reading came pretty easy for them. So, that was great. But like, the sense that you had a choice, that you literally, like this librarian, they wanted to control the things. I'm like, well, I'm not really about, like, I don't think actually labeling sexually explicit books is such a bad thing. Like, you're not banning them. You're literally just labeling them. And when I had to sign up for a library card for my kid when they were little, you got a library card until you were a teenager that were like, you weren't getting in the teenage books. Like, you were supposed to be in the not teenage books. And I thought that was perfectly reasonable. And so this idea that somehow like the librarians get to be the ones to be the gatekeepers, and that the implication that kids actually, except for the like this labeling of books, would somehow be a travesty when all the books are labeled and none of the kids have choices in what they read, is just like central to the overall structure. So anyway, sorry to like be going off on all of that, but I just feel like it's all one big Skinner box. Okay. So let me see. Okay, so moving on to Sidney Bijou, a clinical experimentalist. Forster and Lindsley conducted their human operant research with autistic and schizophrenic patients committed to inpatient psychiatric wards. Although neither man had ever worked with psychiatric patients or had any clinical experience, each was primarily interested in extending the free operant method to other species and generating experimental results. Okay. So again, like in the credibility of like, well, you're an Ivy League person, you have no experience or whatever, but like, we'll let you work with our most vulnerable population. Sure. Because like, you've got a fancy degree. Why not? Like, and besides, we really want to know how conditioning works on people. Okay, so they had access to these relatively captive populations, partly through their connections and partly because they were individuals who were deemed beyond help and were powerless to make their own decisions about whether or not to participate. Like literally. And I'm just going to say, like in the beginning of this book, this person is very pro Skinner. This is not really a critique book. So, okay. In an era well before well-established ethical review procedures and institutional review boards, these patient populations were, so to speak, up for grabs. For their part, Forster and Lindsley imported or adapted their techniques to suit the situation, but did not view the idiosyncrasies of their particular subjects as detracting from their research aims, nor did they intend their studies as attempts at therapy. Perhaps surprisingly, despite Sidney Bijou's clinical background, he extended the free operant situation to studies of normal children, leaving extensions to quote-unquote clinical populations to his students and colleagues. Bijou began his training in the 30s as a clinical psychologist, receiving his master's degree at Columbia in 1937 with Henry Garrett and his doctorate at the University of Iowa in 1941. Between his degrees, he took a position at the Delaware State Mental Hygiene Clinic near Wilmington. In what was typical of psychologist roles at the time, this job mainly involved psychological testing, report writing, and diagnostic consultation. However, while at Delaware, he worked closely with Joseph Jastek to develop the Wide Range Achievement Test of Academic Skills, which remains a widely used test to this day. Bijou then applied to do a PhD at Iowa on the recommendation that he work with Kurt Lewin, and I've written some about him too, who was described to him by G.W. Hartman at Teachers College as a gifted person who was going to do great things in the field of child development. Bijou's affiliation with Lewin, however, did not pan out. Unbeknownst to Bijou, Lewin was on the staff of the Iowa Child Welfare Research Station and was not a member of the Department of Psychology, where Bijou was registered. So after a rather circuitous route, Bijou actually ended up working with noted learning theorist Kenneth Spence, who became not only his advisor, but also a close friend. As Bijou remarked of his doctoral training, among the highlights of my training at Iowa were Spence's 2-semester course in animal learning and conditioning and his informal seminar, The Monday Night Group. In the Monday Night Group, major topics included a chapter-by-chapter review of Clark Hull's manuscript, Principles of Behavior, Gustav Bergman's course on logical positivism and statistics, research design, and systematic psychology. So I just want to take a stop here and just mention, this was in the first chapter of the book, but it really emphasized that, like, among Skinner's, the things he developed this air crib, which was like a climate-controlled box for babies that they would just wear a diaper and they wouldn't have to wear any clothes or have blankets, and that they would like be optimized in their box with the temperature. So like to reduce the mom's workload or whatever. And so like this was very controversial at the time, the baby in the box. And then the other thing was when his daughter went to school, he started actually developing online education. Like it wasn't online at the time, but it was like modular digital education. Reinforcement education. And so there was a lot of controversy at the time, even about the use of robotic teachers and where that was all going. But Skinner was very, very much in the education space. And so I think like later, hopefully we'll get to this with the token economy, but you know, and I'm not a gamer, but it feels like the entire, both social media and gaming, it's on like credits and token and dopamine hits, like every like click thing, like that's a token, that's a tokenized behavior reinforcement mechanism. And so like thinking about like conditioning children from very, very young ages, even these PBS Kids apps that are geared at like 2 and 3-year-olds, like literally they're being treated like these pigeons and rats from the beginning. Okay, so okay, after completing his doctorate with a dissertation on experimental neurosis in rats, Bijou spent 2 years at a residential school for developmentally retarded children and 3 years in the military service. Yeah, wonder what that was about, right? And when he was ready to apply for academic positions in 46, yeah, so he was in military, yeah. He was chair of the Indiana University Psychology Department, and the Pigeon Lab was not yet born. Bijou was about to start the second phase of his experience and training. As the chair at Indiana, Skinner needed a director for the newly established clinical program, and he was looking for someone with an experimental learning background and clinical experience, and Bijou was perfect. His training with Spence provided him with the experimental learning qualification, and his work at Delaware and the military attested to his clinical experience. Yeah, okay, so he's probably doing IQ tests with the military. It would be a short, although lively appointment. At Indiana, Skinnerian, Hullian, and Kantorian views all jockeyed for a position. Debates were heated and intellectually stimulating. As Bijou noted of his acquaintance with Skinner in this period, quote, Skinner knew I was oriented toward Hullian learning theory through my training with Spence, but did not push his view. Despite this congenial and exciting, let me see, gosh, this is going on a bit. We'll get there. I'll just keep going. You guys are still hanging out with me. Despite this congenial and exciting environment, neither Skinner nor Bijou lingered long at Indiana. Skinner left just 2 years after Bijou's arrival to take a permanent appointment at his alma mater, Harvard University, where he immediately set up the Pigeon Lab. In 1948, Bijou left Indiana too, but headed west instead. He accepted a position at the University of Washington as an associate professor and director of the Institute of Child Development. Now, this is important because actually both Iowa and Washington are centers for these interoperable database systems linked to Pay for Success Finance. So, you know, at the time, I remember making a map of all of the database centers connected to the social impact bonds. and thinking like, Iowa, I don't know anything about Iowa, right? But Iowa was where Lewin, I believe Lewin was at. And yeah, Lewin was at this child welfare center. And, it was framed as progressive, right? And even the Iowa education tests. And, I mean, not bragging, and actually it's kind of embarrassing to think about it in the past, but like I think I tested well on those sorts of tests, and like you think like, oh, well, we have these bad tests now, but remember the Iowa tests? Those are the good tests, like the good old days. And I'm like, no, I don't think there were ever any good old days. Like they were always bad. So there's one of the big data centers. There's one at Penn, there's one at Chicago, there's one in Olympia, Washington. I think it's actually at what's that really liberal school? Evergreen, yeah, is embedded there. And there's one in the UK Science Center, and I can't remember. There's like 6 of them. But Iowa, like it's important that this place isn't, because also when you think about like University of Washington is really central in the development of AI and the development of gaming and the development of these sort of DNA data storage and all sorts of biophysical systems that they're developing. So anyway, being at University of Washington feels important. So they're talking about this nursery school. Okay. So he accepted a position at the University of Washington as associate professor and director of the Institute of Child Development. And when he arrived, the institute consisted of a 2-room clinic housed within the psychology department where children were administered psychological tests. Bijou had something different in mind. He envisioned a research organization consisting of a clinic, a preschool, and a child study unit. In 1950, he realized his vision, and a new institute was opened. It included a child development clinic, a 2-unit nursery school, and a research lab. To appreciate the magnitude of both the physical and theoretical shifts that occurred under Bijou, consider the recollection of Eileen Allen, one of the psychologists at the precursor of what became the ICD nursery school. This is a quote. The ICD nursery school, as we so fondly called it, was housed in a 2-story frame building built in 1905 for the Alaska-Yukon Exposition. The philosophy was primarily developmental, a la Giselle, with strong undertones of Freud. This was to change dramatically, however, when we became the Developmental Psychology Laboratory Preschool. Under the leadership of Bijou, Bauer, and Wolf, the preschool teaching staff were converted from a psychodynamic, genetic, and biological determinism to full-blown learning theory behaviorism a la Skinner. And within a couple of years, we were publishing groundbreaking studies carried out in the naturalistic environment of the preschool classroom. So it kind of makes you wonder about the people who have their kids in these academic preschools, right? Like they're like test labs. Okay. Yet despite Bijou's exposure to Skinner, Indiana, and Allen's assessment of the preschool Skinnerian conversion, when Bijou first arrived at ICD, he had not fully committed himself completely to Skinner. His reading of Hull had influenced him deeply, and in his new institute, he hoped to launch a series of studies testing Hullian learning principles with individual children. The challenges of designing the type of experiment he had in mind, however, soon defeated him, and he, quote, turned to the only other procedure I knew, Skinner's operant conditioning model. So it's like, that got too hard. Let's just fall back on behaviorism. A Skinner box on wheels. Perhaps because of his diverse training, theoretical eclecticism, and child development background, Bijou did not automatically assume that his developmental colleagues would be convinced of the value of free operant method with children. In his earliest publications, he tried to convince his readers that a, quote, systematic laboratory approach had much to offer a field where studies in a natural setting were often viewed as more meaningful. He advocated the use of operant conditioning as a promising beginning point for such a systematic approach, noting relationships based on animal studies needed to be tested with human subjects before generalizations could be made, and explaining that a methodological of this kind should enable one to study problems and behavior processes in children by relating direct effects of one variable upon another. To create an operant conditioning situation for preschool children, Bijou, like Forster and Lindsley, took inspiration from the animal laboratory, right? Because that's the first thing you think about when you want to design a preschool is like, how do we make it like an animal laboratory? It's just ridiculous. I explored laboratory procedures that would be comparable in methodology to the animal research situation. I started with a ball drop response. Bijou began by constructing a simple piece of apparatus in which the child could get trinkets by placing a ball in a hole. This homemade device had a number of practical and technical limitations. For example, it was taking children too long to manipulate the ball, and they would occasionally drop it, leading to response rate anomalies. It's like, right? Like, I mean, that's crazy. You have a preschool and then you want to experiment on these kids and you create like a place where they put a ball, but they're not allowed to actually play with the ball. They have to quickly and hurriedly and accurately place the ball in the thing to get the token. Like, it's just actually crazy. Like, the children should be able to play with the ball however they want to play with the ball. And if it goes in the hole, like, good. And they get a token, but like, give me a break. The operant response was too complex, although the device was interesting for the children because it was similar to toys they already knew. A different approach and a different apparatus was required. Okay, so that was too much fun. The kids were having too much fun with that. Have to have something different. In the next iteration of his operant conditioning situation, Bijou replaced the ball dropping with lever pressing, again with the rats, right? The lever was constructed out of a handle grip for the squeezer of an O-cedar sponge mop, and the box with the lever was painted with the face and head of a clown to make it child-friendly. Oh, lovely. Clowns. We always love clowns, right? A cumulative recorder was attached to the lever, always with the seamless documentation. And trinkets were delivered directly to the child via delivery chute. In Bijou's revised setup, a table with these devices was placed in a room with other toys and a one-way mirror. In a typical experiment, an adult who was known to the child acclimated the child to the lab via toy play and was present in the room at all times. She, well, it was usually a woman, was seated behind a cardboard screen out of the direct sightline of the subject to minimize any influence she might have on the child's behavior. Finally, one additional technical innovation was added. Bijou's child study laboratory was motorized. By the mid-1950s, Bijou was convinced that controlled environments of the human-sized Skinner box was an ideal place to conduct laboratory studies with children. Results seemed promising and the technique was efficient. So he designed a lab to be as close to the naturalistic setting of the classroom as possible, while preserving a high degree of experimental control. The only problem with a room-sized Skinner box was that children had to come to the room. The box was too big to move around. A solution soon presented itself. As Bijou wrote many years later, I was now convinced that the laboratory studies with children should be conducted in controlled settings, like the infrahuman animal studies. And to augment the Institute's facilities, I built a mobile laboratory, a converted house trailer that could be easily towed to any nursery school in the Seattle area where additional studies could be carried out. In addition to an efficient technique, Bijou now had a portable one. To characterize Bijou's mobile laboratory as a Skinner box on wheels is not off the mark. As one behavioral psychologist and colleague of Bijou's wrote to Skinner in 1956, I am due to teach summer school in Seattle where Sid Bijou, you will be interested to know, has an automobile trailer that is a Skinner box for little kids. Okay. All right. I mean, you can see why I needed to read this to you. I know it's a lot. I wish I could find a short way of writing all of the stuff I write. But if you go back and read what I'm writing about the Focolare towns and religion and wellness metrics and training the AI and cyber physical stuff, it all goes back to this. I mean, and I knew it in a general way, but just reading this today, I'm like, I got to get off social media because literally these stupid likes and clicks and shares are just, they're the trinkets. They're the trinkets that they're out there. Okay. Research and service. In 1961, Bijou immersed himself in operant psychology, thus rounding out his conversion to the Skinnering approach. He spent a sabbatical year at Harvard, during which he audited Skinner's famous undergraduate lecture course, Nature Science 114, and attended Pigeon staff meetings, which typically ended on a high note with a round of beer. Meanwhile, his group at the ICD was experiencing its own series of high notes. As Todd Risley, one of the ICD's graduate student researchers, remarked on the convergence of people and projects at the Institute of Child Development became caught up in a remarkable time of discovery and excitement. People came from miles around to listen, to question, to present their work. Much of the excitement was fueled by an increasing number of demonstrations of the power of operant approach in providing solutions to behavioral problems. Bijou's labs, both stationary and mobile, were supporting the research of a large group of graduate students and new faculty members, many of whom were quickly moving into applied areas. Again, so this is like, it's not just a few people, they're actually creating whole fields, and then those fields move into applied spaces in actual school districts. And then, it's the turnaround trading, and there's the reinforcement of the trainers and the reinforcers. Like you get affirmation if you're doing what everybody wants you to do, which is the behaviorism. In 1962, Montrose Wolf, then a doctoral student at Arizona State University, and we know all about Arizona State and Michael Crow, right? The military billion-person university, joined Sidney Bijou at ICD. Wolf's task, a wolf in preschool, right? Wolf's task was to help head up the grant-funded Human Learning Laboratory at Rainier State School for the developmentally disabled just outside of Seattle. Although Wolf was hired to run a human operant laboratory, his training and orientation predisposed him toward applied work. With colleagues at Arizona State, he had already developed a design token economy system to teach reading to preschool children. Wolf was aware of the pioneering nature of application at this time, later noting, quote, "Few had made the leap from lab to the other side of the one-way mirror or to schools or homes. In fact, some were of the opinion that such a leap was premature and unwise because we didn't know enough and that we needed to wait for more basic human operant research." Okay, so I just want to say also, like, I used to actually have, a friend, like my first two talks that I gave, like public talks, were in the Seattle area. One was in a downtown library in Seattle, and one was at the Kent area school district in 2017 and 2019, the fall of 2019. And at the time, there's this huge push for what's called PBIS, like positive behavior instructional something. Like it is a token economy. It's a behaviorist reinforcement token, and it is very, 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 very big in the state of Washington. And I had friends at the time who had kids in schools and working in schools, and they knew this. And now I think probably the tokenization is like, once they get all the kids on blockchain, like the zinging of the points and the tokenomics, that's going to go like right into their permanent record for the twinning and the credit scoring. It's really, and also Glenn Weil, who was one of the three authors with Buterin and Olhaver on the soul-bound token paper, right? Like what happens when these stupid PBIS tokens become your soul-bound token? It's just really, really not good. Okay, regardless, Wolf seized opportunities at Rainier to further develop applied behavioral techniques. The result was a combination of research and application. Within 2 weeks of arriving at the University of Washington, Wolf was called into Bijou's office along with graduate student Todd Risley. Bijou had been contacted by the director of a nearby children's psychiatric hospital to consult on the difficult case of a severely autistic child who refused to wear his glasses. The child, christened Dickie in subsequent research reports, had recently had a cataract operation, and he was required to wear glasses or face blindness within 6 months. Despite a 3-month hospitalization, no one had been able to get him to wear his glasses. Bijou put Wolf and Risley on the case, and the result was their classic study with Dickie, who not only learned to wear his glasses, but went on to graduate from high school. As Risley retrospectively remarked, Mont never did the job he was hired to do, generate useful knowledge from a human operant laboratory, but with the excitement and productivity of everything else, no one seemed to notice. Interestingly, Bijou credited his exposure to Foerster's work at Indiana for his willingness to take on the case in the first place. As he later noted, "If it hadn't been for Charlie's program on autistic children, which I visited several times, I don't know that we'd have dared to arrange a program with a severely disturbed child like Dickie." Clearly bitten by the bug of application, Montrose Wolf then collaborated with teachers at the ICD nursery school to help eliminate the regressive crawling of a 3-year-old girl and to increase the peer interactions of a severely isolate preschool girl. As Eileen Allen, the lead author in this paper, reported, quote, "Teachers learn to gather their own data. I coined the phrase collecting data on the hoof. We demonstrated that teachers could collect data that were the core of sound intervention programs for individual children and were also reliable to a high degree when matched with the data of independently reliability raters." And so, like, that's the whole push behind all of the ed tech. I mean, not the whole push, but a huge piece of it is that we're in the data economy, we're in the knowledge economy, we're in this like whatever non-rivals goods economy, and they're going to say the data is being collected to optimize the children for their best future, to put their brain in a robot. But they need the data to run the impact deals, and they need the data to train the AI. And teachers are never going to be able to collect data with fidelity the way a device is, right? And at this point, we know that the device, it's not just your keystrokes and the behaviors that are coming out of it. It's literally emotion sensing, and the cameras built into these devices, that I'm dealing with right now, like they can like gather emotional and behavioral data from that too. And then eventually you're probably going to have some sort of wearables. Like I remember early on in my research in education being really shocked to find out that the Gates Foundation was funding galvanic skin bracelets to like track engagement with online learning, and like smart chairs, really like literally your chair could tell if you're scooching around or you're not paying attention or whatever. Like everything becomes a sensing environment for that data collection. And the teachers' jobs were always going to go away, because ultimately the teachers would never provide the amount of data that the device would. I mean, that is literally the economic construct we have, is that the economy runs on data. Therefore, humans can't collect data the way devices collect data. Therefore, we have to enmesh ourselves in technologies and sensors inside and outside to generate the data that's demanded by the economy. And nobody's talking about that. Like everyone's just saying, like, of course we want human teachers. Of course we want human elder care. We want human nurses. They don't understand the economic imperative behind the data running everything. They just don't get it. They think that it's actually just like the world runs the way we like, in a humane way. And increasingly it doesn't run in a humane. I mean, for many people, it hasn't been humane for a very, very long time, but for increasing numbers of people, it won't be humane. And increasingly these bets and the data is being gathered and managed and pattern recognition through giant supercomputers, and that was one of the things that hit me the hardest early on when I started looking at the National Laboratory for Education Transformation and all the people connected with that, Marcy Lauk, and it kept going back to supercomputers. Like, and I kept thinking, why? Like at that point, I just kept thinking like, oh, this is about test scores. This is about using data to close schools or data to sell software. But no, it was supercomputers were to run the simulations. Like, it wasn't just one, really. It was Los Alamos. It was San Diego supercomputer. It was Argonne. It was the one in Austin. It was all these supercomputers. So soon, like the Skinner boxes are going to be run by HAL. Like, it's not funny, but that's literally where we're going. So, okay. So they got the room size Skinner boxes. Yeah. So in recalling the transition from basic research to applied research in this period, Bijou made explicit the link between human operant labs and the study of children's behavior in natural settings. The methodology for studying children's behavior in natural settings was an expansion and adaptation of the laboratory operant conditioning method. And I think about lab schools, like all these lab schools. I remember at the time in Philly, like thinking like, a lab school. In fact, I think like my kid's school, which is a magnet school, is a lab school. Like, you don't actually want your kid to be in a lab school. Now that I think about it, it was meant to like sound good, and I don't think it was good. The techniques of measurement and recording made their way from the room-size Skinner box to the actual classroom. In doing so, however, they underwent certain necessary transformations. Continuous recording via pre-programmed equipment gave way to direct behavioral observation by trained observers. The reversal baseline design involved, one, a baseline measurement of behavior. So that's the pre-tests of all the schools. Two, introduction of behavioral intervention, followed by three, its removal to see if the behavior reverted to the baseline level. That was used to ensure that the intervention, withdrawal of attention for undesirable behavior, and systematic positive reinforcement of a desirable behavior was solely responsible for the change. This was research and practice, as Allen and her colleagues wrote at the end of the report on Anne. Such a combination of functions of research and service seemed practical and desirable. By the early 1960s, the body of work that employed Skinner's experimental methodology with humans as well as other species was well established. And although this research was undertaken primarily for the purpose of extending and testing the free operant model itself, it often held implications for application. Indeed, in the same very, very early period, the application of Skinnering principles to individual behavior problems had already begun and was quickly taking hold in the field. The research from the human operant labs was not as impressive to those Skinnerians who were already using operant principles outside of the box. Jack, Michael Wolff's mentor and one of the Skinnerian pioneers, commented retrospectively that the idea that we were going to have to do research to prove that reinforcement works, that didn't seem plausible anymore. It was like gravity. To many Skinnerians, the efficacy of positive reinforcement and the power of shaping were face evident. Tightly controlled replications of various reinforcement schedules with goldfish, dogs, chimps, young children, and schizophrenics, although interesting from a technical and scientific standpoint, seemed unnecessary as justification for actually using the technique to pragmatic ends. So they wanted to actually get around to using this stuff, right, to manipulate behavior. As early as 1949, Paul Fuller had used operant procedures in a clinical setting to shape the arm movements of a vegetative human organism. I'm not sure what that means. Fuller's study became one of the classic firsts in behavior modification, leading to Sidney Bijou to remark to him years later, "Paul, I don't know of anyone who got so much mileage out of one measly experiment." In the late 1950s, a group of graduate students, including Montrose Wolff, began meeting at the University of Houston. Now, I feel like this is important that these people are in Houston because, we went down to Houston, Jason and I, and Rice University is there. So, and University of Houston is the Forsyth Center. So at the University of Houston, under the tutelage of Jack Michael, who was trained as a quantitative experimental psychologist, had bought a copy of Skinner's Science and Human Behavior years earlier for a course he subsequently dropped. And it sat on his shelf for a while gathering dust. And when he decided he needed more material for a course on learning he was about to teach, he finally cracked it open and was immediately drawn to the practical issues it addressed. In his words, quote, "When I tried to think about why it was so attractive, it was the many realistic examples. I mean, every page had something that illustrates the principle that Skinner had introduced in the early parts of the book. He illustrates the principle maybe by talking about pigeons and then gives many everyday examples of the same phenomena in terms of normal adult humans," unquote. For Michael, Skinner's jump from pigeons to humans was precisely key to his appeal. Michael quickly assembled a group of students who were similarly interested in Skinner's ideas, and they set out to apply some of his principles to the problems they found in their own backyard, the university campus. Teodoro Ayon, member of the group and an existential psychologist by training, recalled being somewhat skeptical at first. Quote, "Well, let me see. It didn't really grab me exactly. I was introduced to it by Jack Michael in the context of a course he was teaching, but I couldn't understand him too well. It was very hard reading to do. What I understand better was the emphasis on having a few subjects and intensive observation rather than loads of subjects and having to work on the statistics. But I did not think necessarily, frankly, it would work with people," unquote. Conversely, another member of the group, John Mabry, recalled excitement of taking Skinner's principles from classroom and applying them to his personal life. Faced with the challenges of raising an active 2.5-year-old daughter, he self-consciously used reinforcement of incompatible behaviors to ensure that she would not venture onto a busy street near their home. He remarked, "It was the first time that any course in psychology or any reading had even suggested a clear application. Commonplace now among a small segment of the population, this was intensely exciting then." Other examples could be invoked to demonstrate the development of applied research in this period of the late 1950s and early 60s. As I have already mentioned above, Montrose's work and influence was an important part of this transition. As behavior analysts demonstrated the efficacy of these techniques on a patient-by-patient, child-by-child, or student-by-student basis, the momentum of application grew. Findings from human-sized Skinner boxes held little interest for this new breed of behavior shaper. As Risley later wrote of his mentor, Wolff's attitude towards the work coming out of human operant labs, quote, "Wolff came to consider laboratory research on human behavior to be mostly a dead end with scientific trappings. And 5 years later, when he created the editorial policy of the new Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis, he explicitly excluded laboratory purported analogs in favor of the in-context observation and investigation of real-world phenomena." So I was going to say, that's they want to get rid of the box because they want it everywhere. Like they need the ubiquitous computing everywhere in it. So it's sort of like, you know, I haven't finished reading like The Invisible Rainbow. I just started it, but this idea of electricity at first, like my house is an 1880s row house, and when it was built with gas for lighting, and then later it was replaced with electricity. So at some point, the electricity was sort of obvious outside of the wall, and then it went into the wall, and so that's where we're at with mixed reality. Is that the Skinner box is literally mixed reality that is going into everything and becoming invisible. I think that's the takeaway from this piece, is that they wanted to pull it out of the box and then make it pervasive. And it's this pervasive computing that we're in. Okay. The lack of interest may have been mutual. Researchers trained in the spirit of the Pigeon Lab also viewed the work of their more pragmatic colleagues somewhat skeptically. As Jack Michael put it, quote, "At the time, Lindsley and many of the operant conditioning people were very strongly methodologically oriented to the point where they felt you could not possibly collect reasonable data unless it was automatically collected." Again, so like now we're at the point where the two things converge, is they wanted the automatic data collection, right? So they needed the box to collect all the data. So they needed the mats and the mechanical devices to chart out the behaviors as scales like on the paper. And so they felt like if you took it outside the box, you wouldn't get as much data, and that they really wanted the data. But where we're at now is with digital identity and cyber physical systems, like we're threading the needle. Literally the box becomes everywhere, becomes the cybernetic enclosure. Okay. He was derogatory towards the kinds of things I would talk to him about, like the token economy, getting kids to read, and working with various problems. He was not convinced that our report of what we were doing was valid, unquote. So for his part, Michael reported that human-free operant research held little appeal for him personally, although he respected Lindsley's work and was glad he was doing it. Michael's group went full steam ahead with the application, and when he asked his opinion of applied research of that period, Lindsley remarked he objected to it because it ignored rate of response. But he also noted significant resistance to basic human research, belying his own biases, cited as an example the lack of research on children raised in air cribs. That's the skin. It amazed me that 250 children had been reared in air cribs. That's the Skinner baby box, whatever you want to call it, and no one ever put it on a lever. No one had put it in a lever. Okay. Bijou represented a more truly transitional figure. He was convinced of the importance of experimental child research and devoted to it in his own career, but he nonetheless facilitated the work of Wolf, Risley, and others who exemplified the new breed of behavior modifier. As Michael noted, quote, "I was aware of Bijou's work, and again, Bijou and Baer were doing essential research, experimental research on children's behavior. And they were not attempting to change behavior for practical purposes. They were studying the behavior, just like Og Lindsley was studying it. And it took Mott Wolf to coming to Seattle and working with Sid for a while to actually institute all the modification stuff." Okay, so the Wolf institutes all of the modification. All right. Baer and Bijou were more uptight about the methodological aspects. Mott wanted to get the girl to stop crawling. So that's their applied piece. Application soon more or less monopolized the field, although the distinction between research and application was blurry, as the commonly used term applied research demonstrated. Fairly rapidly, a further deconstruction of the human Skinner box occurred. Interventions with individual students in individual classrooms gave way to the design of entire schools offering Skinnerian programs. Hospitals and prisons also became hotbeds of contingency management. In 1968, Ayan and his colleague Nathan Azrin published their full-length monograph describing a token economy program on a psychiatric ward. This program and others like it inspired a veritable explosion of behavior modification in institutions. The Skinner box was being gradually expanded in favor of total environments for the remediation of problem behaviors. It is to these total environments that I now turn, starting with the psychiatric ward. So yeah, that's pretty intense. And like what I want to point out with like both in the social impact finance space is that these dashboards, really like they're engineering behavior on a dashboard, they're linked to mental health and incarceration. So both like the space and schools, right? So all of the spaces that they were working on in behaviorism are directly linked to social impact finance. And I would say if you're still like you don't have a handle on the social impact bond piece, there's an important lecture by Justin Leroy, and I found it early on in my research. He's a professor in California now. I can't remember exactly where, but he wrote a paper called Bonded Life, and he ended up presenting for an exhibit at the Whitney Art Museum. I'm sorry, my nose is so itchy. It's like, I don't know why. Maybe it's operant conditioning. I can't talk about Skinner with my nose itching. So Justin Leroy was invited by Cameron Rowland to do this talk at the Whitney Museum, and it was about the social impact bond, and the social impact bond was connected to Ventura County, California, and it was essentially they were using operant conditioning, something called moral recognition therapy, MRT, and this MRT actually started out in Tennessee, I think, in Memphis. And it was used in carceral settings. And there was some investigations that was done at the time that it seemed to be connected in many respects in terms of how it was structured to Scientology. And so, like, I think we really need to understand about these controlled environments and the ways in which they have been test beds, and like maybe less so mental health institutions because they've been decentralized and people have been pushed out onto the streets, but definitely prisons and schools in the Skinner tradition. Okay. Okay. I don't know. Are you guys up for, like, I know it's 2 hours. I think this next chapter isn't quite as long, but I'm going to start reading, and if it all falls off, if you all go away, then I'll stop. Okay, chapter 3, conditioning a cure, behavior modification in the mental institution. Okay, this is a quote. To the uninitiated, behavior modification sounds complicated and dangerous. In this age of consumer rebellion, mental hospitals might do well without controversial programs. However, the hospitals need the magic of the new approaches, and perhaps they can be forgiven for jumping on bandwagons. The behavior modification bandwagon seems more substantial than most, as it is braced by concepts from research in the psychology of learning. Okay. Although the pharmacological revolution of the 1950s and the community mental health and patients' rights movement of the 1960s brought some profound changes to service provision for the severely mentally ill, only in some cases were these improvements. Moreover, they did not eradicate the phenomenon of the backward psychotic, the chronically institutionalized schizophrenic patient for whom neither drug regimens nor community support provided viable alternatives to full-time inpatient care. As the above quote reveals, by the late 1960s, psychiatry and psychology were still in search of effective ways to treat those patients whose plight seemed most hopeless. Psychoanalytic talking cures were among the only other tools in the psychiatrist's toolbox, and these too proved largely ineffective in realizing the roots of psychosis and returning the schizophrenic to reality. The question of how to move beyond palliative care and actually improve the functioning of the chronically mentally ill, many of whom had spent their better part of their lives in institutions, remained unanswered. Could Skinnerian psychologists provide a solution? As I have shown in the previous chapter, by the early 1960s, several groups of the Skinnerian psychologists stood on the brink of full-scale application, and they were looking for problems to solve with their new technology. No human behavior problem seemed too difficult to tackle, not even the backward psychotic. In the case of psychosis, however, Skinnerians brought not only a technological solution, but a reformulation of the problem. Psychosis should be treated as nothing more than psychotic behavior, with their goal of decreasing psychotic behavior itself, rather than understanding its etiology. Along with a kit bag full of behavioral techniques to accomplish this goal, practitioners of behavior modification offered, if not magic, at least common sense, can-do approach to treating psychiatric's most challenging cases. One of the most widespread applications on behavior modification in the mental hospital and elsewhere during the mid to late 60s and early 1970s took the form of the token economy. So I would say, like, token economy. This is soulbound tokens. This is about currency as behavioral script. This is starting with little kids in schools all the way up to mental institutions and prisons, everything on a token, your life on a token. And I do think that this idea of tokenization and the transaction, that who's giving tokens, who's receiving tokens, how you use your tokens, that's all that Celo is about. Like, not all, but like that's a key part of what Celo is about. And the exchange of tokens provides information about like values, behaviors, and it's making social relations and individual like mental states visible to machines. It's making all of that stuff computable. And that's what I'm trying to like reinforce, like really drive home in the pieces that I'm writing. What we're dealing with right now is attempted catalyzation of generalized artificial intelligence. Now, I'm not saying that that can ever actually fully manifest, but that's what they're attempting to get. And they literally want to turn all of our exchanges into tokenized transactions so that it can be used for pattern recognition and machine learning. So that's what these token economies are about. And it does make me wonder, like, how far back, like, were these decentralized ledger systems meant for this all along, right? If is you know, because I keep saying crypto is the distraction, the digital gold is the distraction. I mean, if what you're doing is fixating all of your critique on crypto, on that it's fraudulent, that it's a bubble, that it's whatever, and you're not addressing the fact that it's actually this smart contract layer of mixed reality that's embedded in state intelligence, you're missing it. You're missing it. And like, I can't tell you how, like, I just don't see a lot of people talking about that. Like, I'm grateful for Raul and Leo and Sebs and Ali for doing some of that work and surfacing that. But that's the conversation. That's the conversation that we need to be having. And that's why there's going to be no good crypto, because ultimately, if you're accepting crypto, you're accepting mixed reality. Like, you're accepting that. And it's not our game. Like, none of this is like, these people have a really long lead time, like Harvard, the Office of Naval Research, the National Institutes of Mental Health. Like, if maybe they didn't give the whole handbook, but the machinery that's been running this and getting this put in place is generations old. Like, it's not like we're going to somehow reclaim it and use it for our nice, fun game, like the nice game that we want. They want us to think that. And so just like caution on all of that. Okay, let me go back token behavior. Okay, so one of the most widespread applications of behavior modification, was the token economy. Although tokens themselves, literally plastic chips, coins, and cards, among other trinkets, had already been employed as generalized reinforcers to change individual behavior on a case-by-case basis in the early 60s. These studies had been made in several published articles. The first comprehensive token economy was developed and implemented by Teodoro Ayllón and Nathan Azreen at Anna State Hospital in Illinois between 1961 and 67. In the history of psychiatry, Ayllón and Azreen's 1968 monograph describing their token economy for chronically institutionalized schizophrenics stands as a classic in the literature. At Anna State, Ayllón and Azreen broke new ground in behavioral treatment by conceptualizing mental illness in purely functional behavioral terms and by designing a comprehensive token economy involving the entire staff and population of patients on a special ward. Unlike the largely psychoanalytic psychiatrists who ran most of the treatment programs in state hospitals and who saw behavioral aberration as symptoms of a deep-seated psychic conflict, Ayllón and Azreen chose to regard these symptoms simply as behaviors like any others. And in their formulation, if you could decrease or remove the aberrant behavior and increase or shape socially acceptable ones, the patient would come close to resembling a non-psychotic individual. If the staff of a whole ward of patients could be taught to systematically award tokens for functional behavior, and patients could learn that these tokens could purchase a range of desirable commodities, behavior modification might prove its worth in the psychiatric hospital. So again, like, I just want to sort of reiterate, if they're able to install the kind of world that they're imagining of smart toilets or smart door locks, drone surveillance, all of the crazy things that they have in mind that are not yet scaled, but I think they intend to try to scale, like control of food systems, control of access to labor, control of social relations. Like they're literally going to create an entire cohorts of people who will have a mental break, because that's not how people are supposed to be. That's simply not how that's not how to be human. Like literally it's making humans into machines, and that doesn't work. And so by doing that, I think that it feels like there's almost an anticipation that they're going to make people mentally ill, and then they're going to create these nudge distractions to try to reinforce some understanding, like a conformity to the mentally ill society, and then say that the people are cured because they've been made to conform to the mentally ill society, and not exhibit aberrant behavior, meaning like they're not confronting the aberrations of society that are inhumane, that they will conform themselves to it. And so I feel like we're moving into a moment then, like potentially where I talk about often as like the open air prison, but like the open air mental institution, like where, who knows? Like, I'm not saying that pharmaceuticals will go away, but I'm sure that it feels like these token economies, and and they may not even be real tokens anymore. Like it's literally digital credits, digital money, gamification, that it's going to be controlling so many things. So it's, and part of, the last piece, I'm going to put it out tomorrow, but I talk about these like tiny house communities that are being set up for our chronically unhoused people. And they're like, essentially they're sheds, they're little sheds. And then the casitas with the Internet of Things, those will be the next step up when they get it to scale. But, I feel like those are going to be the mental institutions, right? And you're going to pay for your room and board with your behavioral compliance, and that's where it's going. And there's going to be people who are connected to faith communities, connected with all of this. So, it'll be framed as charity, and it's not. None of it is. So, okay. As word of Ion's and Ezrine's work spread, particularly after the publication of their interim report on activities at Anna State in 1965, a veritable explosion of token economies in classrooms, psychiatric wards, and homes for the mentally retarded, reform schools, and prisons ensued. In this chapter, I document the prehistory of the Anna State token economy and the work of Teodoro Ion, and then describe Ion and Ezrine's classic program in more detail. And I then briefly outline the proliferation of the token economy in a variety of settings, including the mental hospital, but also in homes for children and adults with developmental disabilities and in education. The late 1960s and early 1970s marked the heyday of the token economy as an institutional treatment approach. However, as I will note briefly at the end of this chapter, and then document more fully in chapter 4, a number of practical, ethical, political, and legal issues curtailed the continuation of many programs and slowed the momentum of the token economy by the end of the 1970s. So I guess there were issues with this token economy that made them go out of fashion. But I think that a lot of this has to do with these future programs of like radical participatory democracy, and sort of like setting everything up, to be fluid, and that they'll create new standards of behavior that will make these things legal. So Teodoro Ion and the prehistory of the token economy. Teodoro Ion, a Bolivian-born, existentially trained clinician, arrived at the University of Houston in 1957. That same year, his soon-to-be mentor, Jack Michael, arrived as a faculty member and attracted a bevy of students interested in Skinner's ideas and how to apply them to human problems. Ion had actually come to work on his doctorate with Lee Myerson, a rehabilitation psychologist with no a priori allegiance to Skinner's approach, although he too would come to appreciate its practical applications in his own field. Ion, in fact, had little interest in operant psychology despite Michael's enthusiasm, and remained somewhat skeptical of its apparent theoretical simplicity. Nonetheless, as Michael noted, Ion was eventually drawn to the Skinnerian approach because existential psychology was good at understanding but not doing. And Ion was open to the idea of doing something practical. We could make things open to the idea of we can make things work with people, and he liked that. And so Ione was attracted to Michael's group and soon joined them in discussing how to apply the principles of operant psychology to everyday problems. As I alluded to in the previous chapter, the campus preschool at the University of Houston provided one of the first behavior change projects that the group undertook. Interested in testing out the practical worth of behavioral principles, Ione approached the teachers at the preschool and asked them if they could identify any behaviors in the children that they might like to see changed. Now, I just want to reinforce here, like, who is funding preschools right now, right? There's a huge push for universal pre-K. Now, granted, we have an economic construct that requires adults in households to either have multiple jobs or multiple parents work. There's not many people who can afford to have young children at home with a parent. And so clearly there's a huge cost issue. So now they're providing subsidized pre-K. And even like Jeff Bezos is funding these Montessori preschools. He's funding the Montessori preschools because these children are going to be labs of learning agents for testing data for machine learning and for impact markets. That's what this is about. And so I think we have to understand the fact that this would be like connected to, like, these people have no scruples about testing things out on preschool kids. Like, how can we change up preschool kids' behavior? Not because the teachers came and said we have problems. Literally, they're like, we want to test our technology. What do you got? What do you got that we can fix, right? So the only problem the teachers could come up with, because they're preschoolers and they're teachers that work with preschoolers and they know how to do it, right? They don't actually have that many problems. Okay, so the only problem the teachers could come up with was that they had a little girl who did not like to color in her coloring book, right? Apparently, this unwillingness to color caused some disturbance, as coloring was a frequently invoked activity in the preschool, and she would consistently cry and tantrum when asked to do so. So, taking the teacher's concern at face value and eager to try out an operant theory in the real world, Ione began to sit with the girl during coloring time, and whenever she turned her gaze towards the coloring book, he would deposit a small candy in her cup. And gradually, he proceeded to reinforce closer and closer contact with the coloring materials. Michael remarked that it took Ione a couple of weeks to get the little girl coloring happily without a tantrum. Okay. So I want to say, like, I've done also some research around these robots that are called Now, N-A-O. I think they're Swiss, but they're also used a lot in Japan and the RoboCup stuff. And they're like little robots that are, I don't know, 2.5 feet tall. And they're like your friend, like your little buddy. And they're sort of put out there that this is about, personalized instruction, and the teachers can't be everywhere at once. So you're going to get your own personalized robot. So imagine like the reinforcement conditioning to like make you get used to coloring in the coloring book isn't a guy with putting candy in your cup, but is a robot nudging you. Like, and specifically when you understand, like, going back to that, they were targeting children on the autism spectrum. Like, those are the children right now that are being targeted for the robot use. And they're saying like the kids like it, right? The kids don't actually want to interact with people. They'd rather interact with a robot. And so those, their impact markets being built around autism as well. And it's because the robots get the data with fidelity and they have emotion recognition in them too, which is really creepy. So, okay. This early success was quite gratifying to the young researchers. It seemed they had a technology that was relatively straightforward to implement and apparently highly effective. If this behavior could be shaped, what about others? The next project the group undertook involved students attending a remedial summer reading course offered at a nearby high school. Students who needed help in reading before progressing from junior high to high school had to enroll in a course that required them to work through a series of reading workbooks. Pat Cork, one of the members of Michael's group, had a friend who was a teacher at the school. And again, the group inquired, were there any problems of human behavior that aspiring behavioral engineers could tackle? Apparently, some of the students were not working in their workbooks as instructed. The research group, assuming that the workbooks were in fact effective in teaching reading skills, decided to give the students points for correct answers in the workbooks. Because these students were older than the children in the university preschool and had more diverse interests, the researchers decided to use points as generalized reinforcers, which could be accumulated and used at the end of every class to buy small toys and trinkets according to each student's desires. These points, which performed like money, were among the first tokens used in behavior analytic program of behavior change. Michael pointed out the similarity of this system to the system of monetary allowances that the children were used to, and remarked that it was just a natural extension, a common sense idea that led them to use a point system. The program was never written up or published, and the researchers learned that although they could use token reinforcement to get students to finish their workbooks, the students were not necessarily learning how to read effectively, thus setting an appropriate and relevant behavioral end goal clearly. Thus, setting an appropriate and relevant behavioral end goal was key. Deciding on appropriate behavioral goals would prove, in fact, a recurring and rather thorny problem for the behavioral engineer. And I also want to point out, like in this, in terms of Houston, one of the other site visits we made was to KIPP Charter School, like the original KIPP Charter School, Knowledge is Power, which has another connection to Penn. One of the co-founders was a Penn alum, and I think a Teach for America did the Teach for America program in Houston, and end up, I think, like sort of co-opting like an elder teacher in the Houston School District's approach. But this is conditioned reinforcement learning, and it's a no excuses disciplinary charter school program. And in this program, like some of the schools were so firm with the kids that you would go in and like you had to earn a desk. You literally, like, you started, and if you had to follow all the rules to get enough points to actually have a desk. And if you didn't, you just sat on the floor. So there were all of these rules that went along with it, with the uniforms. And if you didn't do certain things, you had to turn your uniform inside out because you couldn't be associated with the group and the branding. And it was really, really, really messed up. So that's another Houston connection there. Okay, so the next step for Ayon was an internship at Saskatchewan Hospital, a psychiatric hospital in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. Still a graduate student, Ayon was in need of summer work and had a connection with one of the supervisors at the hospital. And when he arrived at Saskatchewan, he was basically given free rein to try out operant principles on some of the hospitalized psychotic patients. Yet Ayon was skeptical. Quote, "When I went to Saskatchewan, what I really had in mind was a test for myself. It was kind of a test that couldn't work. I didn't think operant reinforcement was going to work. My view was, if I work with people with whom everybody tried everything, including drugs, and it's only 3 months, I mean, I'm obviously not in the guild yet. I'm just a graduate student. I would try it for myself to see how that perhaps this is really interesting, but I didn't see how it could work. You didn't know the people, and whatever they did was so far out that I didn't see how you could change them." That's the end quote. So thus armed with a skeptical but enterprising attitude and access to the back wards, Ayon quickly observed that the professionals most intimately involved in the day-to-day care of the patients were the psychiatric nurses. He quickly enlisted the help of the nurses in identifying which patient behaviors to change and in setting up and implementing individualized programs for a number of patients. That sounds kind of like an IEP, right? So, for example, Lucille made frequent visits to the nursing station and disrupted and interrupted the nurses. Another patient's psychotic talk was identified as problematic since it was often resulted in her being attacked by other patients. Another patient was physically assaultive, another refused to eat, and others exhibited hoarding behaviors. In each case, Ayon analyzed the contingencies that seemed to maintain the behaviors, often the attention of the ward staff, and taught the nurses a variety of operant procedures to rearrange these contingencies and reduce the frequency of undesirable behavior, and in some cases, increase desirable behavior. In assessing the significance of this work, which resulted in a now classic article by Ayon and Michael entitled "The Psychiatric Nurse as a Behavioral Engineer," the fact was it did not have much practical significance except for making the lives of the nurses better. But it did have theoretical significance. The psychotic individual was susceptible to the same reinforcements as normals, and this was important. Importantly, it also gave Ayon valuable experience working with staff and patients in a ward environment and convinced him that the operant approach could really work. Now, I also want to mention like the whole ward idea is that if you haven't seen it, there's a documentary film that, again, I think it's like a controlled conversation. It's not the whole thing, but it's interesting about WeWork, the founder of the WeWork principle. And, they developed WeWork, and then they actually also had a We Live component. And then they also had like some sort of We School, and then like this We Library. So there's all of these We's. And for the longest time, nobody could quite figure out it was this unicorn company and what were they actually doing and were they really making any money? And then eventually it imploded, and sort of the film blamed it all on this guy and his like cult of personality. But I don't think it was really about that. I feel like the plan is controlled social behaviors in ward type situations. And then others have actually like referenced Ted and Ben Gertzel, like the use of the kibbutz and the unibutz, which is the people with the Foundation for Integrated Education. So that there is this plan, I feel like, to have, again, not total isolation, but controlled socialization, and to have those behavioral exchanges, both individual and among different people and among individuals to authority, documented for the machine. And I feel like that's what's coming. And what's his face? Boots, right? Riley, is that his name? That Sorry to Bother You. Like at some point I thought like, oh, he doesn't know like that his movie Sorry to Bother You is the real thing. Like I don't think we've gotten to the end point with the horse people like at the end, but we're getting there. Like the Gulag, we live together dorm environment is getting there. And this is something that's being reframed as co-housing, co-sharing cooperatives. And again, I'm not sitting here being the total reinforcement about like everything private property solves everything or that we shouldn't share stuff, but clearly their plans for the circular economy are not a gift economy, not a genuine reciprocity. It's really all about the data aggregation, the data collection. So I think if we go back to understanding that this stuff came out of monitoring behavioral compliance in a ward environment, that's really useful. Okay, so Ione returned to Houston after a summer in Weyburn and graduated with his PhD from the University of Houston in 1959. He was then hired back to the Saskatchewan Hospital for 2 postdoctoral years to continue his work with patients, supported by a grant from the Commonwealth Fund. I should probably look that up, Commonwealth Fund. I think I've heard it. I don't know if there's more than one. In his second year at Weyburn, he was joined by Eric Houghton, with whom he explored the use of food as a reinforcer to control psychotic behavior. Okay, food as a control mechanism. Again, with Houghton's technical expertise and the influence of Nathan Azreen and Ogden Lindsley's published article on the reinforcement of cooperative behavior, Ione devised an ever more elaborate system to engineer behavior. For example, he attempted to set up a situation in which pairs of Weyburn schizophrenics would cooperate in pushing a sequence of buttons in order to receive a coin or a penny, which could then be used to gain access to a television set. Okay, like that's really intense. All right. So cooperation to push a series of buttons to get access to television. Okay. So I will say, and I'm trying to remember the name of the thing. I think it's called Adovo, actually. So MacArthur was funding a tablet-based. It was called Adovo. I'm pretty sure it was a tablet-based behavior modification system for prison, use in prison. And initially it started out that families would have to put money into people's accounts for them to rent these tablets. And the tablets would have online education and behavioral therapy. And once you actually did enough work, like to get enough credits, you would unlock access to entertainment. So essentially the families were underwriting these classes, these courses. This was subsidized by the MacArthur Foundation. Again, MacArthur Foundation is totally connected to insurance. And it was used in prison settings. And what the people all said was like, oh, like when you gave the tablets out, people were all like totally sedated. It was like total sedation. And so I think eventually it moved on that the families didn't have to pay for the tablets anymore. And clearly these are going to be connected to impact investing. And I can't remember the young guy's name who was in charge of it. He's like, I'm doing this because my dad worked in management of prisons and he wanted to help people. But this individual is also a member of the LDS Church. And we know that they're really deep into all of the stuff with the data and the digital identity. So anyway, yeah. So behavior management and pushing buttons reminds me a bit of that Lost TV show with that you had to go back and like keep pushing all the buttons in the right sequence. So yeah, so there you go. Okay, so they're going to push the buttons to get the television. Through this work, he convinced himself that even nonverbal patients could grasp the function and value of a generalized reinforcer. When his 2 years in Saskatchewan came to a close, Ione once again began looking for work. Although applied behavior analysis, or applied behavior research as it was still being called, was intensifying on the West Coast with Bijou's group in Washington, Ione was impressed with behavior analyst Nathan Ezrin's published research and his methodological innovation and his writing style. Reports of dark and damp Washington weather was also unappealing to the Bolivian-born Ione, and he began to cast about elsewhere for job opportunities. With the intercession of Israel Gold Diamond, Ione made Ezrin's acquaintance, and Ezrin invited Ione to join him in Illinois. Ezrin had graduated from Harvard in 1956 and was working as a research director in the Illinois Department of Mental Health. And again, Illinois was like one of the early institutions connected to blockchain identity and having a blockchain task force because they're the commodities futures trading. That's Chicago. Also, Argonne National Lab is kind of central to all of the radio eugenics. Okay, so it would prove to be a fateful pairing, and together they began to conceptualize Anna State token economy in early 1961. They received a grant to support the work in June of that year and began implementation in November. Armed with extensive familiarity with the Skinnerian corpus and direct experience working with both normals and hospitalized psychotics, Ione and Ezrin set out to design a complete ward environment based on operant reinforcement theory. The Anna State token economy. Quote, a state mental hospital is a severe testing ground for any theory of human behavior. Almost every conceivable behavioral difficulty can be seen there, often in its most extreme form. Any simple answer that one might consider for the problems of one patient seem irrelevant for other patients. It seems that every type of explanation has already been proposed, applied, and found wanting in its general application, including psychotherapy, group dynamics, recreation therapy, vocational therapy, drug therapy, etc. One feels compelled to do something, anything, to assist this forsaken segment of humanity. Okay, unquote. At Anna State, the segment of humanity to whom Ione and Ezrin devoted a total of about 6 years was a group of 45 female patients transferred into their, quote, special ward environment on a rotating basis. That is, at any one time, there were a maximum of 45 patients in the special ward. In making this their patient selection, Ione and Ezrin specifically asked for the involvement of those patients who were benefiting the least, that is, not at all, from existing ward procedures elsewhere in the hospital. Supervisors were asked to identify the patients whom they would most likely like to transfer out of their own wards. Ione and Ezrin described the women who came out of them as disheveled, unkempt, and largely unintelligible or mute. They typically received only rare visits from family and friends, on average 2 visits a year, had come from rural environments, and had spent an average of 16 years in the psychiatric institution. To describe them as forsaken didn't seem too far off the mark. But what did this select group of women find on their new special ward? In terms of physical specifications, the ward itself consisted of 5 patient dormitories, a kitchen and dining room, a recreation room with a token-operated television set, a nurse's station, an examining room, and 2 offices and a restroom for the staff. On duty were a physician, a nurse, a psychologist, and attendants. An average of 2 attendants worked the ward during the day, with 1 attendant staffing the night shift. Given that a typical psychiatric ward in this period might have 1 attendant for every 100 patients, it seemed that the special ward was indeed an improvement over standard operating procedure. Again, 1 person matching like 45 people in a lot of need. That seems pretty hard. Once transferred to the motivating environment, as Ione and Ezrin christened their unit, patients were expected to choose an off-ward job as well as participate in on-ward duties in order to earn tokens that can be exchanged for a variety of reinforcers. In operant terms, these jobs were the responses. In Ione and Ezrin's formulation, serving meals, cleaning floors, and sorting laundry were responses that were defined as necessary or useful to the patient to function in the hospital environment. While this point would actually come under legal scrutiny later in the history of the token economy, the rationale was to engage the patients in functional and adaptive work activities that would assist in the day-to-day running of the hospital and the ward. They remarked that these kinds of works resembled the jobs that might be expected of the patients out in the outside world, but noted that outside employment was not the end goal of the program, a point to which I will return. So I want to point out here too about the laundry that I guess it might have been in January 2019, because so much of this was happening in Philadelphia. There was a gathering with the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. And at the time, the head of it was Patrick Harker, and he was a former Wharton professor, and he had ties to the Catholic Relief Services. And he gathered all these people, including our former mayor, Michael Nutter, who was uh, uh, Michael Bloomberg's go-to guy for what works government. And he what was I going to say? They all gathered together for this like prosperity out of poverty program, and they were getting it all set up like clearly. This was January of 2019, and one of the people, I made a big map. This is like some of the big maps that I made with Little Sis that disappeared, but that like one of those people there was running a commercial laundry. So I do think that we have to understand this idea of, and it's not unlike welfare to work, right? The welfare reform systems, but like the access to free labor or unpaid labor, unwaged labor for contingent economies is really, really important. And laundry was one of these things. So, okay. So the off-ward jobs that were offered to the patients included dietary worker, serving meals and cleaning tables, clerical worker, typing, answering the phone, laboratory assistant, cleaning cages and floors in laboratory, filling water bottles, and laundry worker, feeding sheets and towels through the mangle and folding linens. On-ward duties included helping run the kitchen and dining room, waitressing at mealtimes, providing secretarial assistance, cleaning the ward, serving as an assistant janitor, laundry assistant, or nursing assistant, helping staff carry out grooming and recreational activities, running errands, and giving tours of the ward to visitors. In addition to performing these duties, patients could also earn tokens by engaging in a number of self-care activities, such as grooming, bathing, toothbrushing, exercising, and bed making. The overarching philosophy was to provide a system in which the opportunity to engage in a whole range and variety of functional behaviors was maximized, and every functional behavior was reinforced. Eliminating or decreasing dysfunctional behaviors that continue to interfere with an individual's ability to participate in the token economy was a secondary goal. So this is sort of like those merits, right? Like what is the 100 million merits or whatever, like that. And this is the piece that I get frustrated with people in the wellness space and the alternative health space, and the narrative of like, oh, you shouldn't be focused on injections. You should be focused on like physical fitness and what you eat and all of these things. And I'm like, no. Like, again, we should be focused as a society in creating a world in which people have time to do those things and feel supported and have access to healthy food. But you don't make it a requirement, because these self-care tokens, like, again, even that frame, like how often do you hear self-care? Like that's going to be one of the wellness metrics. You don't want that being reinforced in cyber physical space. You really don't. Okay, so full-time and active involvement of the patients in many and varied useful activities was the objective. In many cases, as functional behavior increased, the behavioral problems or symptoms subsided. In cases where this did not occur, Ione and Nazreen worked with individual patients to shape necessary behavior, such as self-feeding in the case of Wilma, or to reduce maladaptive behavior, such as wearing excessive amounts of clothing, as is the case of Rita. Once earned, what would tokens buy the industrious psychiatric patient in the motivating environment? Okay, I'm just going to read that sentence again because that's crazy. Once earned, what would tokens buy the industrious psychiatric patient in the motivating environment? Now, just like picture that in the context I'm talking about, this future world, right? Ione and Nazreen developed 6 categories of reinforcers. 1, privacy. For example, the opportunities to select a room in the dormitory, purchase a screen or room divider, or procure a personal cabinet. That's really, really sad. Like, you have to earn script to have some privacy, for crying out loud. 2, leave from the ward, including walks off the hospital grounds and trips to town. 3, social interaction with staff, including private audiences with a variety of ward staff, chaplains, and social workers. Guys, this is bad. Okay. 4, devotional opportunities, such as the option to attend religious services. Recreation opportunities, such as watching movies or the use of the radio, choice of TV program, And 6, purchase of a wide variety of commissary items. The rationale, simply put, was in providing a range of reinforcers. They could provide something that would appeal to everyone. Over the 6 years of the program, a total of 65 patients participated in the token economy. In their 1968 monograph, they reported that of these 65 patients, 58 performed at least some of the duties contributing to the functioning of the ward, defined as at least 1 hour of work per day for a minimum of 40 days. Only 7 patients failed ever to reach this level of work. In terms of these duties, 30 patients held one or more of the ward positions for over a year, and 10 held various positions for as long as 3 years. In the case of off-ward jobs, 20 of the 65 patients held one or more of these positions for 1 year or more, working 6 hours a day. Ione and Azreen concluded the degree of useful employment of a large number of patients over such an extended period is significant because of all the patients selected for study in the motivating environment had a long history of idleness. Now, again, that goes right back to this whole eugenics discussion. Further, they suggested that the nature and arrangement of work and its reimbursement approximated for these participants most of the conditions of employment in the natural environment. Notably, Ione and Azreen did not use the criticism of discharge into the community as a measure of the success of their motivational system, even though some of the patients were discharged from the hospital to the adjacent halfway house. As they noted, many of their patients were of such an advanced age, over 65, had spent so much of their lives in the institution and no longer had any connections with family, friends, or social support to which they could return, that discharge as an outcome made little sense. The institutions had truly become home for most of these patients. In terms of treatment evaluation, Ione and Azreen preferred to stick directly to assessing the extent to which patients were engaged in useful and functional behaviors. State programs lay in the extent to which inactive patients became active and functions replaced dysfunction. Okay, so the impact of Anna State. Ione and Azreen's reports of their work prompted visits from many interested researchers and practitioners. Many of these people took what they observed at Anna State and set up token economies in their own institutions, many of which serve very different populations, for a review of token economies implemented in a wide range of settings in the 70s. See Kasdan, 1977. The token economy approach was extended to the behavior of children in nursery schools, the physically and mentally disabled in sheltered workshops, juvenile delinquents in correctional institutions, and developmentally delayed adults in institutions for the retarded. The classroom provided especially fertile ground for the development of token economies, and we're seeing this. This is exactly what EdTech is about. In reviewing the use of token economies in education, Krasner noted the seminal influence not only of Ione and Azreen's work, but of Sidney Bijou's associate Jay Bernbrower, who was using token reinforcement in classrooms for mentally retarded pupils by the mid-1960s. Another example is the use of the token economy was at Mimosa Cottage, set up by the University of Kansas Bureau of Child Research Workers in 1965. It was a residential program for educable girls that employed a token economy to reinforce personal grooming behaviors, occupational and academic skills, and social behaviors. Unlike the Anna token economy, the goal of Mimosa Cottage was to return at least some of the high-functioning girls to the community. But with first extending the use of the token economy to a large class of children with behavior problems in a public school setting. In addition, the proliferation of token economies in these diverse settings, many practitioners working with the chronically mentally ill took Anna State as a direct inspiration for setting up token economies on their own psychiatric wards and also set about evaluating them. In a 1969 survey of token economy programs in Veterans Administration hospitals, 27 token economy programs in 20 different hospitals involving 935 patients were reported. Nor was the token economy a purely American phenomenon. A 1973 review of behavior modification in the UK revealed 16 token economy programs in psychiatric hospitals and hospitals for the mentally handicapped at the time. In Australia, Winkler implemented a token economy at Gladesville Psychiatric Hospital, a large facility in Sydney. By the mid-1970s, it seemed as though modalities were jumping on the token economy bandwagon, and it was on its way to becoming a widely implemented treatment approach in the psychiatric hospital. The token economy appeared to offer, if not magic, at least a substantial improvement over custodial care and possibly a significant improvement over other forms of therapy. In fact, in 1977, amidst calls for more tightly controlled and rigorously designed studies comparing token economies to other interventions, Gordon Paul and Robert Lentz published just such a study. The psychosocial treatment of chronic mental patients was the accumulation of a 10-year process in which they systematically compared 3 treatment approaches for the chronically institutionalized mental patient. As Paul wrote, the comparative project involved 3 ongoing groups of the most severely debilitated chronic mental patients ever subjected to systematic study. They randomly assigned 84 patients to 3 conditions: a milieu therapy program, a social learning therapy program, and usual hospital care. The staff administered both the milieu and the social learning programs. The primary component of the social learning program was a highly specific token economy involving structured educational activities. The milieu program consisted of living groups in which 9 to 10 patients per group were charged with exerting pressure on individual members to change by engaging in life skills or academic classes. Paul and Lentz concluded, based on an extensive array of outcome measures as well as follow-up, that the patients who participated in the social learning group achieved greater discharge rates, were maintained longer in community, and required less psychotropic medication than the patients in the other 2. Certainly, this was good news for the token economy. Or was it? Decline of the token economy in the psychiatric hospital. Despite promising scientific evidence for the efficacy of token programs and their rapid proliferation in the 1970s, the number of psychiatric ward token economies actually declined over the 1980s and 90s and are infrequently used today. As Glynn has noted, quote, in writing about recent advances in token economy approaches in the treatment of schizophrenia and other serious psychiatric disorders, one faces paradoxes. The token economy represents one of the most well-validated, comprehensive, non-medical treatments for serious psychiatric illness, yet surveys indicate that it is currently rarely used in clinical settings. In analyzing and explaining this perplexing decline, authors have repeatedly noted a number of contributing factors internal to the token economy, as well as the impact of developments external to it. First, despite their effectiveness, token economies were not easy to set up and implement. Ione and Ezrin had near perfect conditions at Anna State. It was a small, innovative hospital organized into separate departments, each of which was given a high degree of autonomy. The researchers could make changes within the ward quickly and efficiently with no need for concomitant institution-wide changes or approval by institutional committees. They had the support of the superintendent and dealt with a small number of both patients and staff, maximizing cooperation with and commitment to the program. They also made it easier to train staff. Indeed, staff cooperation and training emerged as a significant obstacle in many subsequent programs. Staff resistance was often rooted in the perception that token economy programs were too much work, required too much record keeping, and were too regimented. Token economy programs specifically were often tarred with the same brush as behavior modification. Generally, they were too mechanistic. They were punitive, inhumane, and they undermined the patient-clinician relationship. Token economies from the staff perspective were not that much fun. In addition to overcoming staff resistance, proponents of the token economy had to convince the hospital administrators that the programs were worth the extra money and resources they required. Not only did token economies require more staff and more staff time for training, implementation, and ongoing evaluation, they also required an increased budget for purchasing the supplies and the reinforcers required to run the program. Combined with these internal factors were a number of changes in the mental health policy during the period. Token economies were developed that created an inhospitable environment for any treatment program requiring long-term hospital stays. Glynn reported that from the 1950s to the 1970s, the average length of a hospital stay in a psychiatric institution dropped from 6 months to 3 weeks. Health insurance companies and government Medicaid and Medicare programs in the U.S. increasingly paid for only shorter stays, and even in-state hospitals in a revolving door style of treatment took hold. This, of course, coincided with the increasing emphasis on community-based treatment for the seriously psychiatrically ill, making implementation of token economies, which required a fairly high degree of environmental control and long inpatient stays, increasingly untenable. Finally, as will be discussed in greater detail in the next chapter, several legal decisions in the 1970s pertaining to the treatment of the institutionalized mentally ill forced changes to and restricted the purview of the token economy. In 1972, the Wyatt versus Stickney ruling dictated that institutionalized psychiatric patients have the right to basic amenities such as access to their personal property, a comfortable bed, a chair, a bedside table, nutritious meals, flexible schedules for eating, bathing, and exercise, access to a recreation room with a television, and so on. This ruling eliminated many of the reinforcers that had been used to motivate behavior in the token economy. The court also concluded in this ruling that involuntary patient labor contributing to the operation or maintenance of the institution was not permissible, even if it were deemed therapeutic. Further, patients who volunteered to work could do so only if paid the minimum wage, and no other incentives, such as access to hospital grounds, day passes, etc., could be made contingent on such work. And finally, the doctrine of confinement in the least restrictive environment meant that treatment decisions had to be carefully justified, and patient movement within the hospital and outside of it could not be arbitrarily restricted, that is, on closed wards. For a detailed review of these and other legal issues on token economy, see Cabston 1978. Okay, we're getting close. There's like 3 more pages. It is fair to say that Ayon and Azrin could not have implemented their program at Anna State in the form they did if they had arrived there 10 years later. And although these rulings did not quash the token economy completely, they certainly demanded that administrators become more creative in designing their programs. They also contributed to the growing public perception that the token economy, at least as it was originally conceived, was inhumane and exploitative. But what of all the patients themselves? Was there any indication that they found the motivating environment either an improvement or a burden? In one of the only reports, if not the only report, of patient reaction to a token economy on a state hospital psychiatric ward, Douglas Bilkin, then a doctoral student at the University of Michigan, outlined both his reactions and the reactions of patients to the enthusiastic attempts of 2 psychologists and their students to implement a token economy. In 1971, I spent nearly 5 months observing a behavior modification program in a locked state hospital ward for 53 so-called chronic schizophrenic women. His period of participant observation spanned 20 visits to the ward, during which time he interacted casually with patients, observed the efforts of the psychologists, students, and ward staff, and saw the token economy at work. Based on these observations, he highlighted a number of concerns. First, he questioned the objectivity of the program administrators in doling out the tokens. The definition of the behavioral goals to which patients were asked to aspire seemed vague at times, and the evaluations of whether or not they had achieved these goals appeared fairly subjective. For example, in the category general behavior, patients could be rated from, quote, bizarre and, quote, obnoxious to, quote, creative and, quote, feminine with their attendant point values. He opined that the token economy appeared to enforce institutional patient behaviors, that is, those that made the functioning of the ward and the institution easier. This often ended up infantilizing patients, as when they would earn stars for participating in the craft program or for interacting with Santa when he made his annual holiday appearance on the ward. Bicklin concluded, quote, the professors, like their students, believed sincerely and intensely in the effectiveness of their enterprise. It seemed never to enter their thinking that by rewarding patients with stars and cigarettes, or by leading them in Christmas parties that more resembled parties of elementary school days, Santa came dressed in full attire, that they were defining patients as childlike and reinforcing an old institutional theme. The professors, far from seeing any dehumanization in their plans, saw themselves as change agents. But how did the patients respond? Did they, in fact, greet Santa with childlike glee? As one patient put it, quote, I think this system stinks. They can go shove the whole thing as far as I'm concerned. I don't care about the stars. Another patient confessed to Bicklin, I had more privileges before this system started. They want me to mop floors for what? Based on these and other reactions, Bicklin concluded that, in fact, many of the patients used strategies of subtle resistance, mockery, and anger to express their opposition to the token economy. Although stripped of institutional power, they nonetheless found ways to exert power over a system to which they were involuntarily subjected. For their part, the program administrators and students really did feel that in activating the patients, they were helping them. This account highlights many of the problems that beset the token economy, especially as legal rulings outlined above unfolded in the 1970s. Some creative research practitioners convinced of the value of offering some form of effective treatment were able to work within the parameters of these rulings and continue to carry the torch of token economy. Although the Anna State program dissolved when Ione left to take a full-time academic appointment at Georgia State University, and Azreen was no longer interested in overseeing it, programs like those at Camarillo State Hospital in California, which began in 1970, continue to this day. Conclusion. So what implications does this account of the prehistory and history of the token economy on the psychiatric ward have for our understanding of the development of applied behavioral analysis? First, it seems that in its earliest stages, the use of operant procedures to change human behavior was motivated by and undertaken with the confidence that the basic laws of behavior established in the animal laboratories would hold true even in these very different and increasingly complex environments. By and large, the problems initially chosen by these new behavioral engineers were circumscribed enough that this proved largely true, and there was a burst of enthusiasm as to what operant principles could accomplish in changing human behavior. There was also a general trend towards presenting these human behavior change ventures as applied experiments, combined with a willingness on the part of the basic research community to accept and publish this work. As applied researchers gained sophistication, programs of behavior change became experiments themselves, and rather elaborate ones at that. This was reflected in the development of the ABA research designs, for example, in which an intervention would be implemented, removed, and implemented again to show that behavior change was the result of the intervention and not random factors. This was both experimentation and application rolled into one. However, the fact remained that the new applied behavior analysts were spreading their science from the laboratory into a whole new and different laboratory, the laboratory of life. This would, in turn, change the science itself. As Skinner noted in his autobiography, people were, italics original, different from rats or pigeons, but we should never know different until we had studied them as we had studied other species. That's Skinner, 1983. It was in the late 1950s to early 1960s the Skinnerian psychology made its first conclusive steps beyond rat and pigeon psychology, providing the impetus for what would become not only a science, but a technology of human behavior. With the rapid expansion of behavior modification into schools, prisons, and hospitals in the 70s, many experimentalists became worried that their applied colleagues had lost sight of their basic science origins and were starting to run fast and loose with a set of techniques that had not been experimentally tested or explored. Their call for closer links between experimental and applied branches of behavior analysis continues to this day. Questions of how, why, under what circumstances, and within what exceptions basic behavioral laws can be applied to human behavior continue to fall under the behavior analyst's sphere of investigation. Although coincidental, it is perhaps significant that in 1968, the year Ione and Azreen published their monograph, that it was the same year that the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis began publication. JABA had been preceded 10 years earlier by the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. The decade between the foundings of these two journals, the first experimental and the later applied, was a pivotal one for the growth and extension of Skinner's principles beyond the laboratory. Their use in the psychiatric hospital in the form of the token economy was one example of this rapid extension from laboratory to life. The Reform School would soon provide another promising venue for the application of operant techniques. After visiting Ione and Azreen at their Anna State program, Harold Cohen envisioned not a motivating environment for his young charges, but a new learning environment, as he and his colleagues, James Philipsak, were to call their real-life experiment at the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. Their new learning environment pushed the physical boundaries of the box and the purview of the technology of behavior even further. All right. So that's 2 chapters. That's a long time. But I just want to say, there is a push now for boarding schools, like urban boarding schools. And I think people are not making the connection, especially for Black and brown communities, underserved communities. They're like, oh, well, we'll send your kids to a boarding school. And, I haven't gotten into this section about the schooling, but I really feel like it's the other model there is the residential school system, which was piloted in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is about 2.5 hours west of Philly, and essentially was a genocidal enterprise. That was kill the Indian to save the man. That was their. It was a military project, and the children actually built the campus of these buildings, and it's now actually the Army War College. So if you're going to learn how to be a high level commander, ongoing education in the U.S. Army, that's where you go. You go to Carlisle, and on the campus, literally the hospital where hundreds and hundreds of indigenous youth died of communicable diseases or what have you. It's now like a boutique hotel for people staying at the War College. And so I took my, you have to go through like military clearance to get there. And I don't know that I'd be able to get in now, but there's like a cemetery of all those kids. And so again, I guess that I'm just wrapping up, but maybe it's because of what I bring in my personal experience, having background in cultural landscape and art history and looking at the signs and symbols. But we're in information warfare. This is literally a war of ideas and narrative. And I think if you see the scope of it, and I've said this before, like the odds don't look good if you leave it at the material realm, like literally just the physical reality of what is happening doesn't look good, right? But my feeling is increasingly that there's lots of things that we don't actually understand about what's happening. I don't think we fully understand how the human body works. I don't think we understand how time works. I don't know that we understand like how reality works. I don't think the fact that a lot of these people, let me see, there's like another one of these books. Yeah. The key people behind here, they're all doing stuff with like metaphysics. I don't understand metaphysics. I was never good at math, but I'm trying to figure stuff out. There are things that we don't know. And I don't think that we have to know all the things. Like, I think there's some integrity just in us to stand up against this, but we have to be clear. Like, we actually have to understand what's going on. And, I don't claim to know all of the things, but I feel like this is a really important conceptual framework that gets outside of this is America, this is Harvard, this is Indiana, this is Michigan, this is Houston, this is not aberration. This is what we are. Like, we let this happen. Like, we send our kids to the universities to learn how to do this shit. And so we have to own this. Like, this is us. We created behavioral economics, and we rolled it out, and we built the sensor networks, and those of us who can see it have to say something. And we have to know where it came from. Again, this is not China. There's nothing in here that had anything to do with China. This is about the US people in positions of power and authority, using other people to use them as their playthings, right? They're experimental, and I'm sure that in many cases they were doing it, the stories they told themselves that they were doing it for the right reasons. But that easily goes south, right? That can go really south very quickly. And like I said, at the beginning, part of the reason that I got off Twitter today was like, this Protocol Labs is a really big deal. It's funded out of Berlin. The old trope, the Germans lost the war, but the Nazis didn't. I've written I can't remember the guy's name, Karsten Stocker, I think. He's out of Germany, about the cyber physical systems and digital identity and nanotechnology and biotechnology and trust networks. And Leo and I did that long piece about the sovereign nature and the interspecies currency and the oracles, these games, these blockchain games, tokenized games in parks and nature, and just making everything an aberration. And all of that came out of Germany. So again, I'm not putting it just on the Germans, but like, we have this synthesis, right, between Operation Paperclip and like, there's a lot of really dark stuff that was happening in research spaces. Anyway, I can't believe you guys are staying with me. My other readings never get this many people after 3 hours, but I hope you understand and try to explain it to people. And yeah, I don't know what to do next because I feel like I'm really like I'm trying to tell a story that is being like just buried by the algorithms, buried by people I thought like valued my work and aren't strong enough to share it because it's scary, I guess. But it's all the this is all the truth. I mean, you could interpret it differently, but I think this is all stuff for us to chew on, and we're all implicated. You know, we're all implicated in different parts of it. We've all had different life experiences, and I'll just say it again. Um, I'm open. And again, I want to have a little bit of editorial control, but like if you're interested in writing something from your own perspective on how all this fits together or what you see, like let me know. Like I don't want this to be the Allison bandwagon. Like I don't need my blog just to be me. Like I think at this point we need to build the broader base, and I can't my intention was never to be the expert. Like I am the expert because of the amount of time I put into it, but I'm not better than anybody. I'm not like I don't know any of these things. I'm not afraid to learn and have opinions about things. I may not understand all of it. So, if you're interested, shoot me an email. Like I said, if you're in California and you might want to like meet up with us or host us or organize a group or something, like we're kind of thinking maybe October ish. And I think at least from San Diego up to the Bay Area, shoot me an email. I'd like to have something to look forward to. But we're doing our thing. So anyway, thanks everybody. Good night.